The moment the federal judge laughed at Daniel Cross, the courtroom erupted in mockery. A single father with calloused hands stood in chains, accused of fraud, claiming he spoke 11 languages fluently, with no degree, no proof, nothing but the word of a janitor's son from a dying steel town. The prosecutor smirked. The gallery whispered. Even his own public defender looked away. But what they didn't know, what no one in that marble temple of justice could imagine, was that the man they were humiliating held secrets that would shatter careers, expose international crimes, and prove that invisible people see everything. This is his story. If you're watching, hit that like button and comment your city below. Let's see how far Daniel's truth can travel. Now let's go back to where it all began. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 7B of the federal courthouse buzzed with the kind of persistent hum that gets inside your skull and stays there. Daniel Cross had been listening to that sound for 3 hours now, handcuffs digging into his wrists, the metal chair beneath him cold enough to leach the warmth from his body. He sat perfectly still, back straight, eyes forward, the way his father had taught him. When the world tries to make you small, you stand tall inside yourself. The courtroom was packed, every wooden bench filled with spectators who'd come for the entertainment, journalists with their notebooks ready, law students taking notes on what they'd later call a textbook case of fraud. The air smelled of floor polish and stale coffee, institutional and impersonal, the kind of place where lives were reduced to case numbers and docket entries. At the prosecution table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Vance shuffled papers with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost. She was 43, Harvard Law, with a conviction rate that had made her a minor celebrity in legal circles. Her suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that suggested she had no time for nonsense. And Daniel Cross, in her carefully constructed narrative, was nonsense personified. "Your Honor," she said, rising with the fluid grace of someone who owned the room, "the defendant's claims are not just implausible. They're insulting to this court's intelligence." Judge Richard Hammond sat behind the bench like a king on a throne, his black robe pristine, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. At 61, he'd presided over this courthouse for nearly 2 decades, and he'd seen every con, every desperate lie, every last-ditch attempt at redemption. He leaned back in his leather chair, one eyebrow raised in what might have been amusement or contempt. With Hammond, it was often hard to tell the difference. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man used to being heard, "I've reviewed the defendant's, shall we say, creative resume. Please enlighten us." Margaret Vance clicked a remote, and the courtroom's projection screen lit up with Daniel's employment application to Trans Global Solutions, a multinational consulting firm. The document looked professional enough, clean formatting, proper headers, organized sections. But it was the skills section that drew gasps from the gallery. Languages: English, native, Spanish, fluent, French, fluent, German, fluent, Mandarin Chinese, fluent, Arabic, fluent, Russian, fluent, Portuguese, fluent, Japanese, fluent, Korean, fluent, Italian, fluent, Hebrew, advanced. Education: Lincoln High School, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Graduated 1998. Certifications: none listed. Professional training: none listed. The silence that followed was broken by scattered laughter from the back rows. Someone whispered loud enough to be heard, "Is he serious?" Daniel didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the projection screen, on the document that had somehow become evidence of fraud rather than evidence of ability. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath the 3-day stubble he'd grown in county lockup. "The defendant," Vance continued, pacing now like a professor delivering a lecture, "has no college education, no language degrees, no study abroad programs, no certifications from any recognized linguistic institution. His father, Joseph Cross, worked as a night janitor. His mother died when he was 7. He grew up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town, I might add, where 93% of the population speaks only English." She paused for effect, turning to face Daniel directly. "Yet, Mr. Cross would have us believe that he somehow, miraculously, taught himself 11 languages to fluency, that he can translate complex legal documents, interpret high-level business negotiations, and navigate cultural nuances across a dozen different linguistic traditions, all without formal training, without credentials, without any verifiable proof whatsoever. Judge Hammond chuckled, actually chuckled, from the bench. "Mr. Cross," he said, leaning forward, "I took 2 years of Spanish in college, and I can barely order a taco. You're telling me you learned 11 languages in Millbrook, Pennsylvania? What did you do? Watch a lot of foreign films?" The courtroom erupted in laughter. Full-throated, genuine amusement at the absurdity of it all. Even the court reporter smiled, her fingers pausing over the stenotype machine. Daniel's public defender, a 27-year-old named Jeremy Banks, who'd been assigned to the case that morning, sank lower in his chair, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. But Daniel Cross did something unexpected. He looked up, met Judge Hammond's eyes directly, and spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom. "No, Your Honor." His voice was quiet but clear, with the slight roughness of someone who'd learned to choose words carefully. "I didn't watch foreign films. I listened to children teach their friends how to play. I heard mothers comfort their babies at 2 in the morning. I sat outside doors while diplomats argued in languages they thought only they understood. I learned because I was invisible, and invisible people hear everything." The laughter died. Not because people were convinced, but because there was something in Daniel's tone, something steady and unshakable, that made mockery feel suddenly inappropriate. Judge Hammond's smile faded. "Mr. Cross, this court deals in evidence, not poetry. Ms. Vance, please continue." "Thank you, Your Honor." Vance clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline. The defendant began offering translation services approximately 8 years ago, operating as an independent contractor. He had no business license, no professional insurance, no credentials to show prospective clients. Yet somehow, he secured contracts with several major firms. Another click. Bank statements appeared on screen, numbers highlighted in yellow. Over the course of 6 years, Mr. Cross invoiced various companies for translation services totaling $847,000. He claimed fluency in languages he cannot possibly speak, charged premium rates for work he could not have legitimately performed, and when confronted by clients who discovered discrepancies in his translations, he disappeared. "That's not true," Daniel said quietly. "Mr. Cross, you'll have your chance to speak," Hammond said sharply. "Ms. Vance has the floor." Jeremy Banks put a hand on Daniel's arm, shaking his head in warning. "Don't make it worse," his expression said. "Just stay quiet." But Vance wasn't finished. She advanced to the most damaging slide yet. A collection of emails from former clients, Global Tech Industries, Hemisphere Consulting, the law firm of Patterson, Wyatt, and Cole. All of them complained of inaccurate translations, missed nuances, embarrassing errors that had cost them contracts or created diplomatic incidents. "One client," Vance said, her voice rising with righteous indignation, "lost a $3.2 million contract with a German manufacturing firm because Mr. Cross's translation of a legal agreement incorrectly rendered liability clauses. Another client faced sanctions from the Chinese government because his translation of a compliance document omitted crucial regulatory language." She turned back to Daniel, and now her expression held genuine anger. "You didn't just commit fraud, Mr. Cross. You endangered international business relationships. You caused real harm to real companies, and when confronted, you vanished, taking your ill-gotten gains with you." "I didn't vanish," Daniel said, his voice louder now. "I was fired. They blame me for their own—" "Mr. Cross!" Judge Hammond's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "You will remain silent, or I will have you gagged. Do you understand?" Daniel's hands curled into fists, the handcuffs clinking softly. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself, to explain, to make them understand. But he forced himself to nod, to swallow the words burning in his throat. "Good." Hammond turned to Vance. "Do you have more, counselor?" "Just this, Your Honor." She clicked to a final slide, a photograph of a small house in Millbrook, paint peeling, porch sagging. This is where the defendant grew up. This is where, according to his story, he somehow absorbed 11 languages through sheer proximity and determination. I'll let the jury decide how plausible that sounds. But there was no jury. Not yet. This was a bail hearing, a preliminary proceeding to determine whether Daniel Cross would await trial in freedom or in custody. And based on Judge Hammond's expression, the decision had already been made. "Mr. Banks," Hammond said, turning to Daniel's public defender, "does your client have anything to say for himself? Any actual evidence to support these extraordinary claims?" Jeremy Banks stood slowly, nervously straightening papers he hadn't bothered to read. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. He's willing to take any language test the court deems appropriate. He has a daughter, Emma, who's 12 years old. She needs—" "I'm sure she does," Hammond interrupted. "But her needs don't change the facts before this court. Mr. Cross has no credentials, no verifiable proof of his abilities, and multiple complaints from clients who claim his work was fraudulent. He's clearly a flight risk. He already disappeared once when questions arose about his qualifications." "I didn't disappear," Daniel said, again, unable to stop himself. "I was blacklisted. When Global Tech made a mistake in their own contract negotiations, they blamed my translation to save face. I had the emails proving it, but they—" "Where are these emails now?" Hammond asked. Daniel's jaw worked. They were on a hard drive. It was seized when I was arrested." "How convenient." Hammond's tone dripped sarcasm. "Mr. Cross, I've been on this bench for 19 years. I've seen every con artist, every fraudster, every desperate person willing to say anything to stay out of prison. And I'll tell you what I see when I look at you. A man who got in over his head, who lied to land clients he wasn't qualified to serve, and who's now concocting an elaborate story to avoid responsibility." The words landed like physical blows. Daniel felt each one, felt the weight of institutional disbelief pressing down on him like concrete. He thought of Emma, who'd cried when the FBI agents had led him away from their apartment in handcuffs. He thought of his father, who'd died 5 years ago without ever seeing his son's abilities recognized or valued. He thought of all the languages he carried inside himself like treasures no one believed existed. "Your Honor," he said, and his voice was steady despite everything, "I'm asking for one thing. 5 minutes. Bring in anyone. Any linguist, any professor, any expert you trust. Give me 5 minutes with them in any of those 11 languages, and I'll prove everything I've said is true." The courtroom went silent. Even Vance stopped pacing, caught off guard by the directness of the challenge. Judge Hammond stared at Daniel for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not the condescending chuckle from before, but genuine belly-deep laughter that echoed off the marble columns and wood paneling. "Mr. Cross," he said, wiping his eyes, "that is the most audacious bluff I've ever heard in my courtroom. You're facing federal fraud charges, your own clients have documented your incompetence, and you want me to waste this court's time on a parlor trick." "It's not a trick," Daniel said quietly. "It's my life." Hammond's laughter faded, replaced by cold dismissal. "Here's what I'm going to do, Mr. Cross. I'm going to set your bail at $500,000, which I suspect you can't pay, and I'm going to schedule your trial for 60 days from now. During that time, you'll remain in federal custody. You can use that time to prepare a more realistic defense. Perhaps consider a plea agreement. Miss Vance, I imagine the prosecution would be open to negotiations." Vance nodded. "Absolutely, Your Honor. If Mr. Cross pleads guilty, admits the fraud, and agrees to repayment terms, we'd recommend a reduced sentence, perhaps 3 years instead of the 15 he's currently facing." "There we go," Hammond said, sounding almost cheerful. 3 years, Mr. Cross. You could be out while your daughter's still in high school. That's a good deal. I strongly advise you to take it." Daniel felt the walls closing in. 3 years. Emma would be 15 when he got out. 3 years of supervised visits through plexiglass, of missed birthdays and school plays, of his daughter growing up without him. 3 years for crimes he didn't commit, for abilities he actually possessed but couldn't prove. "I'm not pleading guilty," he said. Hammond's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool. Ms. Vance has built an airtight case. You have no defense, no credentials, no evidence. You'll be convicted, Mr. Cross, and when you are, I'll give you the maximum sentence. 15 years. You'll miss your daughter's entire adolescence because you're too proud to admit you're a liar." "I'm not lying." Daniel's voice rose despite himself. frustration finally breaking through the careful control. I speak those languages. I earned every dollar through legitimate work. The clients who complained, they used me as a scapegoat for their own failures. I have proof. If anyone would just... Proof that conveniently disappeared? Hammond shook his head. Mr. Cross, you're making this worse. I'm trying to help you here. By assuming I'm guilty? By accepting reality. Hammond leaned forward, and for just a moment something almost like pity crossed his face. Listen to me. I grew up poor too. I know what it's like to want more than your circumstances allow. But lying about credentials, fabricating expertise, that's not the way. You should have gone to school, earned proper certifications, built a legitimate career. Instead, you took shortcuts, and now you're facing the consequences. That's not injustice. That's accountability. Every word was a nail in a coffin Daniel could feel closing around him. The judge wasn't evil. He wasn't corrupt. He was simply, absolutely certain he knew the truth, and nothing Daniel said would change his mind. Bail is set at $500,000, Hammond declared, raising his gavel. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial. We'll reconvene in 60 days for... Wait. The voice came from the back of the courtroom, clear and commanding. Everyone turned. A woman stood in the gallery, mid-50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple blazer and carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. There was something about her presence, a quiet authority that made even Judge Hammond pause. "And you are?" Hammond asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "Dr. Sarah Chen," she said, walking forward down the center aisle. "Professor of Linguistics at Georgetown University. I specialize in multilingual acquisition and sociolinguistic development. And if the court will allow it, I'd like to take Mr. Cross up on his offer." Margaret Vance stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Dr. Chen has no standing in this proceeding." "I'm offering my services pro bono," Chen interrupted smoothly. "As an expert witness for the defense, Mr. Cross claims he can prove his linguistic abilities. I'm qualified to evaluate that claim. 5 minutes of testing, as he requested. If he fails, you lose nothing. If he succeeds..." She paused meaningfully. "Well, then this court will have avoided a significant miscarriage of justice." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversation. Hammond's face had gone from amused to annoyed to something approaching curious. He glanced at Vance, who looked like she'd bitten into something sour. "Your Honor," Vance said, "this is a waste of time. The defendant is a known fabricator, accused fabricator," Chen corrected gently. "Innocent until proven guilty, isn't that the phrase?" Hammond drummed his fingers on the bench, considering. The smart move was to refuse, to maintain order, to follow protocol. But there were reporters in the gallery, and they were all leaning forward, and Hammond could see the headline if he refused. "Judge denies language test to accused fraud." It would look like fear, like he was worried the test might actually work. 5 minutes, he said finally. "Dr. Chen, you may conduct a brief evaluation, but understand, this is not official testimony, this does not constitute a formal defense, and regardless of the outcome, the bail decision stands. This is purely, let's call it satisfying professional curiosity." "Understood, Your Honor." Chen set her briefcase on the defense table and opened it, pulling out a laptop and several books. She looked at Daniel for the first time, and he saw something in her eyes that had been absent from everyone else's. Actual interest, not judgment. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I'm going to ask you questions in several languages. I'll start simple and progress to more complex linguistic challenges. Are you ready?" Daniel nodded, his heart hammering. This was it. His one chance, his only shot at proving the truth that everyone had dismissed as fantasy. Chen pulled up a document on her laptop and began in Spanish. "Traduce esta frase. El abogado defendió al acusado con evidencia circunstancial." "The lawyer defended the accused with circumstantial evidence," Daniel responded immediately. Chen switched to French without pause. "Expliquez la différence entre savoir et connaître dans le contexte juridique." Savoir refers to knowing facts or information, like knowing the law. Connaître means to be familiar with something or someone, like knowing a witness personally. In legal context, the distinction matters for establishing credibility and bias. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Chen's expression remained neutral, but she nodded slightly and switched to German, speaking rapidly. Analysieren Sie den folgenden Satz auf grammatikalische Fehler. Der Angeklagte hat die Dokumente unterschrieben, obwohl wusste nicht die Konsequenzen. Daniel answered in equally rapid German, the error is word order. It should be obwohl die Konsequenzen nicht wusste or obwohl nicht wusste, was die Konsequenzen waren. The negative particle and verb placement are incorrect as written. Judge Hammond had stopped drumming his fingers. Margaret Vance's confident expression had frozen into something more uncertain. Chen wasn't done. She pulled out a book, Arabic text, classical script, and read a passage, then asked in Arabic, ترجم هذا المقطع وأخبرني عن السياق التاريخي. Daniel listened to the flowing Arabic, then responded in the same language, his accent carrying the slight Egyptian inflection of someone who'd learned from native speakers. This is from Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, discussing the cyclical nature of civilization. The passage argues that luxury and comfort lead to weakness in ruling classes, which eventually causes societal collapse. The historical context is 14th century North Africa, during the decline of the Marinid dynasty. He then translated the passage into English, rendering not just the words, but the philosophical weight behind them. Chen's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. No whispers, no shuffling papers. Everyone watching as this handcuffed man in a rumpled shirt dismantled every assumption about who he was supposed to be. Mandarin, Chen said, switching again. This time she pulled up a medical document, dense with specialized terminology, and read a paragraph aloud in rapid Mandarin. Daniel closed his eyes, listening, then opened them and responded. That's a patient consent form for an experimental cardiac procedure. It outlines risks including myocardial infarction, arrhythmia, and potential cerebrovascular complications. The translation is intentionally technical to meet regulatory requirements, but it's written at too high a level for patient comprehension, a common problem in medical translations that often leads to informed consent violations. He then retranslated the section in simpler Mandarin, demonstrating not just fluency but practical understanding of how language works in real-world contexts. Jeremy Banks, Daniel's own public defender, was staring at his client like he'd never seen him before. Because he hadn't. Not really. No one had. Chen glanced at Judge Hammond. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to test one more language. Russian. Hammond nodded mutely. Chen switched to Russian, asking Daniel to discuss the linguistic differences between formal and informal address in legal versus social contexts, and how those differences reflected historical class structures. Daniel responded in fluent Russian, his accent carrying traces of Moscow rather than St. Petersburg, explaining the complex evolution of VI and TI pronouns, how Soviet-era language reforms had attempted to flatten social hierarchies through language, and how modern Russian had partially reverted to pre-revolutionary formality in professional settings. When he finished, Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she closed her laptop and turned to Judge Hammond. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. In 27 years of teaching linguistics, I have never encountered an autodidact with this level of multilingual competence. Mr. Cross doesn't just speak these languages. He understands their cultural context, their historical evolution, their practical application in specialized fields. This is not the linguistic profile of a fraud. This is the profile of someone with extraordinary natural ability and years of immersive acquisition. Margaret Vance shot to her feet. Your Honor, this doesn't change the client complaints, the documented errors in his translations. Documented by whom? Chen interrupted. I'd like to see those translations and the original source materials, because if Mr. Cross possesses the abilities I just witnessed, any errors likely originated elsewhere. Hammond sat back in his chair, and for the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty crossed his face. Miss Vance, do you have the original translation work that prompted the complaints? Vance hesitated. Some of it, Your Honor. The files are there in evidence, but I'd need time to... Time you've had for months preparing this case, Chen said pointedly. Your Honor, I move that this bail hearing be continued until those materials can be properly reviewed. If Mr. Cross's translations are actually accurate and the complaints stem from client error or scapegoating, this entire prosecution may be built on a false premise. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters typing furiously, spectators murmuring, lawyers conferring. Hammond raised his gavel but didn't strike it, clearly struggling with a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. Daniel sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that if he drew attention to himself, this fragile moment of possibility would shatter. "Dr. Chen," Hammond said finally, "your evaluation was impressive, but it was also brief. 5 minutes of conversation doesn't prove Mr. Cross can handle complex professional translation work." "Then let me conduct a full evaluation," Chen responded immediately. "Give me 3 days. I'll test him rigorously in all 11 languages, across multiple domains, legal, medical, technical, literary. I'll document everything, provide a formal report. If he fails, nothing changes. But if he succeeds, this court needs to seriously reconsider the charges." Hammond looked at Vance. "Counselor?" Vance's jaw was tight, but she was a smart enough lawyer to know when to cut her losses. "The prosecution has no objection to additional testing, Your Honor, but the defendant should remain in custody during the evaluation." "Agreed," Chen said before Hammond could respond. "I can conduct the tests at the detention facility. I'll need access to Mr. Cross for 3 full days, 8 hours each day. I'll bring my own materials and an independent observer to verify the results." Hammond considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. Dr. Chen, you have 3 days. Mr. Cross remains in custody, bail unchanged. We'll reconvene in 72 hours to review your findings." He raised his gavel. "This hearing is continued." The gavel fell, and with it something shifted in the courtroom, not quite hope, not quite belief, but the smallest crack in the wall of certainty that had seemed unbreakable just minutes before. As the bailiffs led Daniel away, he looked back at Dr. Chen, trying to convey through his eyes what he couldn't say aloud. "Thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance." She nodded once, a brief acknowledgement, then began packing her briefcase with the same efficient movements she'd used to unpack it. In the hallway outside, Margaret Vance caught up with Chen. "That was quite a performance," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "It wasn't a performance," Chen replied, not looking up from her briefcase. "It was an evaluation. You realize if you're wrong, if he's been studying scripts, memorizing phrases, faking his way through, you're going to look like a fool." Now Chen did look up, meeting Vance's eyes directly. "Ms. Vance, I've spent 3 decades studying how people acquire and use language. I know the difference between memorization and genuine fluency, between studied responses and natural linguistic intuition. That man in there isn't faking anything." "Then explain the client complaints. Explain the documented errors." "I intend to," Chen said. "But I suspect when we look closely at those complaints, we're going to find something interesting. The errors weren't in Mr. Cross's translations. They were in assumptions about what he'd translated, or in source materials he was given, or in clients using him as a convenient scapegoat for their own failures." She snapped her briefcase shut. People love to blame the translator, especially when the translator is someone they can dismiss, someone without credentials, someone from the wrong background, someone who doesn't look like their idea of an expert. Vance studied the older woman for a moment. "You think this is about class bias?" "I think this is about a lot of things," Chen said. "But yes, class bias is part of it. So is educational bias, institutional bias, and the fundamental human tendency to believe official papers over actual ability." She started walking toward the exit, then paused and looked back. "You know what the saddest part is? If Daniel Cross had gone to the right schools, earned the right degrees, had the right connections, he'd be celebrated as a prodigy. But because he learned in the margins, in spaces no one was paying attention to, his expertise is automatically suspect. Tell me, Ms. Vance, does that sound like justice to you?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked away, leaving the prosecutor standing alone in the hallway, confronting questions she'd never thought to ask. In the federal holding cell, Daniel sat on a narrow bunk, still in handcuffs, staring at the concrete wall. The adrenaline from the courtroom was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange, fragile hope that felt almost more frightening than despair. A guard appeared at the cell door. "Cross, your daughter's here for a visit." Daniel's heart clenched. Emma. He'd told the social worker to keep her away, to not let her see him like this, but his daughter was 12 and stubborn and had clearly insisted. They led him to the visitation room where Emma sat on the other side of a plexiglass partition, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes red from crying but defiant. She picked up the phone, and Daniel picked up his side. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, and his voice almost broke on the words. "Dad?" Emma's chin trembled, but she didn't cry. "Mrs. Palmer said you might be in jail for a long time. She said you lied to people." "I didn't lie, Emma. I promise you I didn't." "Then why don't they believe you?" The question was simple, childlike, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Daniel looked at his daughter, at this fierce, brilliant girl who'd grown up helping him translate bedtime stories into 5 different languages, who'd never questioned that her father could do things other people found impossible. How could he explain to her that the world she knew and the world adults believed in were 2 completely different places? "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people don't believe in things they can't understand, and they don't understand how someone like me, someone who didn't go to university, whose dad cleaned houses, could learn what I learned. It doesn't fit their idea of how the world works." "That's stupid," Emma said fiercely. "Yeah," Daniel agreed, managing a small smile. "It is. But we're going to prove them wrong, okay? There's a professor, Dr. Chen, who's going to test me, really test me. And when she shows them I'm telling the truth, everything's going to change." Emma pressed her hand against the plexiglass, and Daniel pressed his hand against the other side, their palms separated by a 1/4 inch of bulletproof barrier. "I'm scared, Dad," she whispered. "Me too, sweetheart. But remember what Grandpa Joe used to say?" Emma's lips quirked in a sad smile. "Fear is just the sound of doors opening." "That's right." Daniel's eyes burned with unshed tears. "So let's be scared together and see what door opens next." They sat there, hands pressed to opposite sides of the glass, until the guard said visiting time was over. As Emma was led away, she turned back one more time. "Wo aini Baba," she said. "I love you, Dad," in Mandarin, one of the first phrases he'd taught her when she was small enough to sit on his shoulders. "Wo ye aini Bao Bei," Daniel replied. "I love you too, precious one." The door closed. His daughter was gone, and Daniel Cross sat alone in a federal holding cell, betting everything he had, everything he was, on 3 days of tests that would either prove his truth or confirm the world's judgment. Outside the detention center, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Dr. Sarah Chen stood on the steps, phone to her ear, already making calls. Assembling materials, preparing the most rigorous linguistic evaluation she'd ever conducted, because she'd meant what she said in that courtroom. Daniel Cross wasn't faking. His abilities were real, extraordinary, and the kind of thing that happened maybe once in a generation. The question was whether the system would recognize that before it destroyed him. The question was whether truth, in the end, would matter more than credentials. The question was whether invisible people who saw everything would finally be seen. And in 72 hours, they'd all have their answer. The detention center's fluorescent lights never truly went off, just dimmed to a sickly yellow glow that made it impossible to tell 3 in the morning from 3 in the afternoon. Daniel lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains he'd memorized in the past 48 hours. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of other inmates, the clang of metal doors, the endless industrial hum of a building designed to warehouse human beings. His mind kept circling back to the same thought. In 60 hours, Dr. Chen would present her findings. 60 hours to prove that the life he'd lived, the languages he carried, the abilities he'd spent 37 years developing, were real. 60 hours before Judge Hammond decided whether to believe evidence or assumption. He thought about his father. Joseph Cross had died 5 years ago on a Tuesday morning, his heart giving out while he was replacing light bulbs in the 3rd-floor hallway of the Thornberry Mansion, one of the diplomatic residences he'd maintained for 26 years. Daniel had gotten the call at work, dropped everything, driven 4 hours back to Millbrook. By the time he arrived at the hospital, his father was already gone. They'd given Daniel a plastic bag with his father's effects: wallet, keys, a worn notebook with maintenance schedules, and a small photograph of Daniel's mother that Joseph had carried every day for 30 years. The photograph was faded, the edges soft from handling, showing a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, forever frozen at 28. What they hadn't given Daniel, what he'd only discovered later, going through his father's small apartment above the hardware store, were the journals. 43 notebooks, filled with Joseph Cross's careful handwriting, documenting everything he'd observed during 26 years of cleaning houses where powerful people lived. Not gossip, not scandal, something far more deliberate and dangerous. Daniel had read the first notebook sitting on his father's sagging couch, afternoon light slanting through dusty windows, and felt his understanding of his entire childhood shift like tectonic plates grinding into new positions. October 15th, 1987. The first entry read, "The Volkov House. Dinner party, 8 guests. Overheard conversation in Russian about shipment delays from Odessa. One of the guests, Mikhail, no last name mentioned, argued about quality control and whether the merchandise would meet specifications. Context suggests human trafficking. The women at the party were young, Eastern European, clearly uncomfortable. 2 had bruises on their wrists. No one else seemed to notice. Note, Daniel turned 5 today. Maria would have been so proud of him. He's picking up Russian phrases faster than I can track. This morning he asked me what pazhalsta meant because he heard Mrs. Volkov say it to her housekeeper. I told him it means please. I didn't tell him I've started teaching him languages for a reason. Daniel had sat with that notebook for 3 hours, reading entry after entry, watching his father's suspicions evolve into certainty, his certainty into careful documentation. Joseph Cross hadn't just been a janitor, he'd been a witness, deliberately invisible, cataloging crimes that happened in front of him because people with power never really saw the man who cleaned their floors. And Daniel, young, bright, absorbing languages like a sponge soaking up water, had been his father's insurance policy. A living recorder who could understand what was being said in rooms where secrets were spoken in languages meant to exclude outsiders. The cell door clanged, jolting Daniel from his memories. A guard stood in the doorway. "Cross, you've got testing in 30 minutes. Shower and change into these." He tossed a set of clean clothes onto the bunk. Daniel sat up slowly, his back protesting. "Dr. Chen?" "She's setting up in conference room B. Brought enough equipment to teach a whole university class." The guard's tone was neutral, but there was something in his expression, curiosity maybe, or the faintest trace of respect. Word had spread through the facility about what had happened in court. 30 minutes later, Daniel was escorted down a series of corridors to a conference room that had been transformed into a makeshift examination center. Dr. Chen had indeed brought equipment, 3 laptops, stacks of books in various languages, audio recording devices, and a video camera on a tripod. "Mr. Cross." Chen looked up from organizing materials. She wore jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt, her steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Beside her sat a younger man, early 30s, with intense eyes behind thick-framed glasses. "This is Dr. Marcus Webb, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at Columbia. He's here as an independent observer and secondary examiner." Webb nodded curtly. He looked skeptical, the expression of someone who'd agreed to participate in what he clearly expected to be a waste of time. "Dr. Webb specializes in detecting linguistic fraud," Chen continued, reading the question on Daniel's face. "If you're faking this, he'll know." "I'm not faking anything," Daniel said quietly. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Chen gestured to a chair. "We'll be conducting tests across multiple dimensions: conversational fluency, technical translation, cultural competency, and improvisational usage. The sessions will be recorded and transcribed. At any point, if you need a break, ask. This isn't an endurance test." Daniel sat. The chair was more comfortable than anything he'd experienced in the past 2 days, but his shoulders remained tense. "Can I ask you something first?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You had no reason to show up in that courtroom." Chen was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him. 6 months ago, I was reviewing applications for our graduate linguistics program. One application stood out. A young woman from Honduras who'd taught herself 4 languages while working as a hotel housekeeper. Her essay was extraordinary, demonstrating deep understanding of linguistic theory despite having no formal training. Do you know what our admissions committee did? Daniel could guess, but he shook his head. They rejected her, said she lacked proper academic foundation. When I argued, I was told that accepting someone with her background would dilute program standards. Chen's voice hardened. That young woman is now working 2 jobs to support her family, and the linguistics world lost someone with genuine gift. So when I read about your case, when I saw a judge laughing at a man claiming autodidactic multilingual fluency, I thought, not again. Not if I can help it. Webb cleared his throat. Sarah's got a crusader streak. I'm here because I'm not convinced you're genuine, Mr. Cross. I think you've memorized some phrases, maybe taken online courses you're not admitting to. By the end of today, I'll know for certain. Fair enough, Daniel said. Chen opened her first laptop. Let's begin with French. I'm going to play an audio recording of a conversation between 2 native speakers discussing philosophy. I want you to listen, then summarize the content and analyze the speakers' regional accents. She pressed play. 2 voices filled the room, rapid and colloquial, their French flowing with the ease of people who'd grown up speaking the language. They were debating Sartre's concept of bad faith, their discussion full of interruptions, half-finished sentences, and cultural references that would be opaque to anyone without deep familiarity with French intellectual tradition. Daniel closed his eyes and listened. Not to individual words, but to the rhythm, the cadence, the subtle markers that revealed geography and class and education. When the recording ended, he opened his eyes. The woman is from Lyon, probably educated at a grande école. Her accent has that Lyonnais precision, but her vocabulary and rhetorical style suggest formal philosophical training. The man is Parisian, working-class background, self-educated. You can hear it in how he pronounces his R's, the way he drops certain syllables, but also in how he frames his arguments, less academic, more practical. They're debating whether Sartre's concept of mauvaise foi applies to modern social media usage. The woman argues yes, that curating an online persona is quintessential bad faith. The man disagrees, saying that multiple authentic selves can coexist without contradiction. He paused, then added, "The man is wrong, but he's asking better questions. The woman's got better training, but she's trapped in theoretical frameworks. It's an interesting conversation." Webb's skeptical expression had shifted to something more attentive. He made notes on his tablet without looking up. Accent accuracy? Chen asked. The woman's Lyon accent is textbook. The man's Parisian working-class accent is authentic. He's not performing it. My guess is they're colleagues, maybe lovers, from different social backgrounds. Chen and Webb exchanged a glance. Chen nodded slightly and pulled up a new file. German, legal document. I want you to translate this contract section and explain the cultural context that makes certain clauses necessary. She displayed a dense paragraph of German legal text on the screen. Daniel scanned it, his mind automatically parsing the elaborate sentence structures that made German legalese particularly impenetrable. This is a Gesellschaftsvertrag, partnership agreement, for a medical research consortium. The section addresses liability distribution in cases of Fahrlässigkeit versus Vorsatz, negligence versus intentional misconduct. What makes it distinctly German is the exhaustive enumeration of hypothetical scenarios. American contracts focus on broad principles and let courts interpret. German contracts try to anticipate every possible situation because the legal culture values certainty over flexibility. He translated the paragraph, then added, "The interesting part is Clause 7, which addresses what happens if research results are misrepresented to regulatory bodies. It's worded to protect individual researchers while exposing institutional leadership to liability, which suggests this consortium has had problems with data integrity in the past." "How can you tell that from the contract language?" Webb asked, his tone sharp. "Because standard contracts don't include that level of specificity unless there's precedent. This clause is protective scar tissue from a previous wound." Webb made more notes, his expression unreadable. For the next 3 hours, they moved through languages like travelers crossing borders. Russian technical manuals, Arabic poetry, Mandarin business correspondence, Japanese cultural protocols. Each test more complex than the last, each designed to catch someone faking, memorizing, bluffing their way through. Daniel translated a Portuguese medical diagnosis, then explained why certain symptoms would be described differently in Brazilian versus European Portuguese. He analyzed a Korean business email and identified the sender's hierarchical position based purely on honorific usage. He took an Italian opera libretto and discussed how the language's musicality influenced the composition. Around hour 4, Webb called for a break. He and Chen stepped into the hallway, leaving Daniel alone with a guard and a bottle of water. Through the door, not closed completely, Daniel heard their conversation. "He's real," Webb said, and he sounded almost angry about it. "I've thrown everything at him. Technical jargon, regional dialects, cultural traps that only someone with deep immersion would navigate correctly. He's not memorizing, he's thinking in these languages." "I told you," Chen said quietly. "Do you understand what this means? This level of acquisition without formal instruction? The linguistic community needs to study him. This could reshape our understanding of critical period hypothesis of adult language acquisition capacity. Marcus, he's not a lab rat, he's a man fighting for his freedom. I know that. But Sarah, if we can document how he developed these abilities, if we can understand the mechanism, we will. But first we keep him out of prison." The door opened wider. Chen stepped back in, Webb following. Both looked at Daniel with new intensity, the kind of focus that made him feel simultaneously visible and exposed. "Mr. Cross," Chen said, "I want to shift our approach. Instead of testing your current abilities, I want to understand how you acquired them. I want you to tell me your story. Everything. Start from the beginning." Daniel took a long drink of water, buying time, organizing memories he'd spent most of his adult life trying not to examine too closely. "Where should I start?" "Start with your father," Chen said. "Start with why a night janitor's son speaks 11 languages." So Daniel told them. He told them about being 7 years old, small for his age, sitting in the service entrance of the Vandermeer residence while his father replaced broken tiles in the master bathroom. About overhearing the Vandermeer children, Alexandra and Thomas, arguing in French because their mother insisted they practice before their summer in Paris. About listening so intently that he forgot to be quiet, and when Alexandra noticed him, instead of calling him out, she'd switched to English and asked if he wanted to learn too. "She taught me like it was a game," Daniel said. "She was 9, I was 7. We'd sit in the garden while my dad worked, and she'd teach me words, colors, numbers, the names of things. When I came back the next week, she tested me, and I remembered everything. She was delighted. It became our secret project." He told them about the Volkov family, where he'd learned Russian from their daughter Katya, who was lonely in a new country and happy to have someone to talk to. About the Chen family, no relation to Dr. Chen, he noted, where he'd absorbed Mandarin while playing video games with their son David, learning the language through laughter and competition and the easy intimacy of childhood friendship. "People think language learning is about grammar books and vocabulary lists," Daniel said, "but kids don't learn that way. They learn through relationship, through context, through wanting to communicate with someone they care about. That's what I had. Not classes. Connection." Webb was recording this, his tablet capturing every word. "But children lose those connections," he said. "You must have. Diplomatic families rotate every few years. How did you maintain the languages after your childhood friends left?" Daniel's expression darkened. "My father made sure I didn't lose them." He told them about the journals he'd found after Joseph Cross died, about his father's deliberate cultivation of Daniel's linguistic gift, not as a party trick but as a tool, about being 11 years old and his father sitting him down at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten mac and cheese from a box, where Daniel had done his homework under a flickering light and explaining something that would change how Daniel understood his entire life. He said, "Son, I need to tell you why I've been taking you to work with me, why I've encouraged you to learn from the families we serve." Daniel's voice was quiet now, remembering. He told me he'd started noticing things, patterns, people coming and going at odd hours, young women who looked afraid, conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He said he documented it all, but he needed someone who could understand what was being said in languages he couldn't speak. Chen leaned forward. Your father was investigating trafficking? He didn't call it that at first. He just said something was wrong and wrong things needed to be made right. He asked if I'd help him, if I'd listen when people thought I didn't understand, if I'd remember what I heard. You were 11, Webb said, something like horror in his voice. I was, Daniel agreed, and I said yes, because I trusted my father and because even at 11, I understood that people who felt invisible had power no one else recognized. He told them about the next 6 years, about his father methodically moving through the houses of Millbrook's wealthy community, the old steel baron families, the new diplomatic corps, the corporate executives who'd bought estates for tax purposes, about Daniel accompanying him whenever possible, especially to houses where his father's careful observations had flagged something suspicious. The Thornberry Mansion was the center of it, Daniel said. Enormous place, 30 rooms, owned by a holding company that rented it to various diplomatic families. My dad had maintained it since I was 5. Over the years, he noticed that certain guests always stayed in the East Wing. Young women, usually. They'd arrive late at night, stay for a few days or weeks, then disappear. The families claimed they were au pairs or students, but my father knew better. He described being 15, sitting in a service corridor with a book, seemingly absorbed in homework while a dinner party happened 20 feet away. Listening to Russian guests discuss transit routes and clearance protocols. Coming home and telling his father everything, watching Joseph write it down in his careful handwriting, building a case one overheard conversation at a time. Did you understand what you were doing? Chen asked. The danger? Not really. Not at 15. It felt like detective work, like something from the spy novels I read. It wasn't until I was older that I understood what we were building evidence for. What would happen if anyone found out? By 17, Daniel was fluent in 7 languages. By 18, when he graduated high school, he'd added 3 more. He'd applied to colleges, dreamed of studying linguistics formally, but the tuition was impossible and his father needed help with medical bills. Diabetes, complications from years of physical labor, the slow erosion of a body that had worked too hard for too long. So I stayed in Millbrook, Daniel said, got a job at the hardware store, helped my dad, kept listening when he needed me to listen, and I collected the languages like treasures, like proof that I was more than the town thought I was. He told them about his mother, though his memories were fragments, her laugh, the way she smelled like vanilla, the Spanish lullabies she'd sung before the cancer took her, about how losing her had made him desperate to hold on to connections, to never forget, to preserve every relationship in the amber of language. When someone teaches you their language, Daniel said, they're giving you part of themselves, their way of seeing the world. When you lose them, the language becomes a memorial, a way of keeping them alive. Chen's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Webb had stopped taking notes, just listening. So I kept learning, Daniel continued. Arabic from the Al-Mansour family's driver, who was actually a political refugee with a PhD in literature. Portuguese from Maria, who cleaned offices at night and told me stories about Brazil during our overlapping shifts. Hebrew from Rabbi Goldstein, who needed someone to help him prepare materials for students and didn't care that I wasn't Jewish. Japanese from online gaming communities, which sounds silly, but worked because I was communicating in real time with native speakers who wanted to win matches, not teach grammar. By 25, Daniel had 11 languages. By 26, his father's documentation had grown to 43 notebooks full of evidence. And by 27, on a cold March morning, Joseph Cross had called a number he'd been sitting on for years, a direct line to an FBI field agent who specialized in human trafficking. He turned everything over, Daniel said. 26 years of observations, names, dates, patterns, conversations I'd translated. The FBI took it seriously. They investigated. But before they could move forward, they needed more. They needed active surveillance, real-time intelligence, and my father's health was failing. Daniel paused, the memory sharp enough to cut. He asked me to take his place, to apply for a position maintaining the Thornberry estate, to keep watching, keep listening, keep documenting. He said it would be dangerous. He said I could say no. But I'd been part of this for 16 years. Those notebooks were as much mine as his, so I said yes. For 3 years, Daniel had worked as a maintenance contractor, following his father's footsteps through the same houses, seeing what Joseph had seen, gathering evidence, building cases, all while trying to start a legitimate translation business, to create a life beyond the shadow work he'd been doing since childhood. That's when everything got complicated, Daniel said, because I was good at translation, really good. And people noticed. Companies started hiring me for high-level work, contracts, negotiations, technical documents. I charged fair rates and delivered perfect translations. Business grew. I thought I was finally building something legitimate, something I could be proud of. He told them about meeting Sarah, a legal secretary who'd needed help translating Portuguese deposition transcripts. About falling in love over long conversations where they taught each other things. Him sharing languages, her sharing law, both of them sharing dreams of better lives than their backgrounds had promised. About their daughter Emma being born, this miracle of a child who looked at the world with curiosity and joy and never questioned that her father could do impossible things. Sarah died when Emma was 2, Daniel said, and his voice finally cracked. Brain aneurysm, just gone. One day we were planning her 3rd birthday party, and the next day I was a single father trying to explain to a toddler why mommy wasn't coming home. He'd thrown himself into work after that. Translation kept him afloat financially and gave him something to focus on besides grief. The FBI investigation was closing in on the trafficking network. Everything was moving toward resolution. Then global tech happened, Daniel said bitterly. They hired me to translate a major contract with a German manufacturing firm. I delivered a perfect translation, but their VP made a handshake deal that contradicted the written contract, promised terms that weren't in the document. When the Germans held them to the actual contract language, global tech panicked. They needed a scapegoat. They blamed your translation, Chen said, claimed I'd mistranslated liability clauses. I had emails proving the translation was accurate, proving their VP had made unauthorized promises, but suddenly my hard drives were corrupted, files disappeared from cloud storage, and Global Tech's legal team was expensive and connected. Other clients had followed suit once the first complaint was filed. Hemisphere Consulting claimed his Mandarin translation of compliance documents had caused problems with Chinese regulators. But Daniel knew the real issue was that Hemisphere had tried to hide environmental violations and needed someone to blame when they were caught. Patterson, Wyatt, and Cole said his Russian translation had created diplomatic awkwardness. But really, their client had made political statements they later regretted and wanted to claim mistranslation. I was blacklisted, Daniel said. No agency would touch me. Word spread that I was unreliable. Companies I'd worked with for years stopped returning calls. Meanwhile, my father's health was deteriorating. Medical bills piled up. Emma needed things. So I kept working independently for anyone who'd hire me, charged less, took whatever jobs I could get. He'd also kept gathering evidence about the trafficking network, kept documenting, kept building the case his father had started. And when Joseph died, Daniel had inherited not just the notebooks, but the responsibility. 2 months after my father's funeral, the FBI was ready to move. They had enough evidence, largely from what we'd gathered. They raided the Thornberry estate and 4 other properties, arrested 16 people, recovered documents proving decades of trafficking, exploitation, corruption. It was huge, international news. Webb's eyes widened. I remember that case, Operation Invisible Eye, 3 years ago? That's the one, Daniel confirmed. The FBI wanted me to testify, but I asked to remain anonymous. Witness protection was suggested, but I couldn't uproot Emma from her school, her life. So I stayed quiet. Let the evidence speak. The people who were arrested never knew where the intelligence came from. They assumed it was electronic surveillance, informants, the usual methods. They never thought about the janitor and his son. But someone found out, Chen said. Daniel nodded slowly. I don't know who. I don't know how. But 6 months ago, things started happening. My client suddenly had issues with old translation work. Complaints appeared that I know were fabricated. My bank accounts were flagged for suspicious activity. And then the federal investigation into fraud allegations. Someone with power and connections wanted me destroyed, and they had the resources to make it happen. The room was silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sounds of the detention center. Webb finally spoke. Mr. Cross, what you're describing isn't just linguistic ability. It's intelligence work. You've been operating as an unpaid investigator for most of your life. I've been trying to finish what my father started, Daniel said. To make sure those women, the ones who were trafficked through Millbrook, who were invisible to everyone except the man who cleaned their rooms, didn't disappear without someone noticing, without someone caring. Chen stood and walked to the window, looking out at nothing. When she turned back, her expression was fierce. Marcus, we need to document all of this, not just for the court case. This is a civil rights issue, a miscarriage of justice. This man has been systematically destroyed for doing the right thing, and his abilities are being dismissed because he doesn't have the right institutional credentials. Agreed, Webb said. He looked at Daniel with new respect. Mr. Cross, I came here expecting to debunk a fraud. Instead, I'm looking at one of the most remarkable autodidacts I've ever encountered. Your language acquisition isn't just fluent, it's culturally embedded in ways that typically take years of immersion. You didn't learn languages, you lived them. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Chen sat back down, pulling her laptop close. Now we spend the next 2 days building an irrefutable case. We document everything, your abilities, your methods, your history. We get sworn statements from people who can verify your work. We find the original files that prove your translations were accurate and the complaints were fabricated. And we walk into Judge Hammond's courtroom with evidence so overwhelming that he has no choice but to dismiss these charges. And then? Daniel asked quietly. Even if he dismisses the charges, I'm still blacklisted. No one will hire me. I've got a daughter to support and a reputation that's been destroyed. Then we rebuild it, Chen said firmly. We publish your story. We use it to expose the systemic biases that allowed this to happen. We create opportunities for others like you. People with extraordinary abilities who've been locked out by credentialism and class bias. Webb nodded. The linguistics community needs to know about you, Mr. Cross, not as a curiosity, as proof that our theories about language acquisition are too narrow, too limited by assumptions about formal education. Daniel looked between them, these two academics who'd walked into his life 48 hours ago and were now talking about rebuilding it from ashes. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to trust that truth and evidence would be enough. But he'd spent his whole life invisible, watching how power worked from the margins. And he knew that changing systems was harder than changing minds. Okay, he said anyway, let's build the case. They worked until the guard said time was up. As Daniel was being led back to his cell, Chen called after him. Mr. Cross, your father would be proud of you. I hope you know that. Daniel paused, looking back at her. He used to say that invisible people see everything. But what he never told me was that seeing isn't the same as being seen. That being right doesn't matter if no one's listening. Then we'll make them listen, Chen said. Back in his cell, Daniel lay on the thin mattress and thought about his father's journals, still locked in an evidence box somewhere in FBI storage. About Emma, staying with a neighbor, probably not sleeping. About languages he carried like armor and wounds, proof of lives he'd touched and losses he'd survived. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb were building his defense. Somewhere, the FBI might or might not be investigating who'd targeted him. Somewhere, Judge Hammond was probably enjoying dinner, never questioning his certainty that Daniel Cross was a liar. But in this cell, in this moment, Daniel let himself remember all the people who'd taught him their languages. Alexandra Vandermeer, who'd moved to Paris and probably never thought about the janitor's son she'd befriended. Katya Volkov, who'd taught him Russian while homesick for Moscow. David Chen, who'd made language learning feel like play. Rabbi Goldstein, who'd shared Hebrew and wisdom in equal measure. They'd given him gifts without knowing they were gifts. They'd made him visible, if only for moments, in ways that had shaped everything he'd become. Tomorrow, he'd fight to prove what they'd given him was real. Tonight, he'd honor their memory by refusing to let the world's disbelief erase what he knew to be true. He closed his eyes and whispered thank you in 11 languages, a prayer to everyone who'd ever seen him when the world looked away. The morning of the third day arrived with the kind of gray light that made everything look washed out and temporary. Daniel had been awake since 4, running through vocabulary in his head like an athlete warming up before a championship game. Russian verb conjugations, Arabic grammatical forms, the tonal patterns of Mandarin that could change meaning with the slightest shift in pitch. His mind was sharp from adrenaline and fear, every language he possessed humming just beneath the surface of consciousness, ready to be called forward. At 8 o'clock, they came for him. Different guards this time, their expressions neutral but not unkind. One of them, an older man with graying temples, said quietly as they walked, "Good luck in there, Cross. A lot of people are pulling for you." Daniel didn't ask who, he just nodded, saving his voice, conserving his energy for what was coming. Courtroom 7B was packed even tighter than before. The gallery overflowed with spectators, journalists, and law students who'd caught wind that something unusual was happening. Daniel spotted Emma sitting in the front row with Mrs. Palmer, the neighbor who'd been watching her. His daughter wore her best dress, the blue one Sarah had bought her 2 birthdays ago, and when she saw him, she pressed her hand against her heart, their private signal. "I'm with you." He pressed his hand to his own heart in return, then forced himself to look away before emotion could overwhelm him. Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb sat at the defense table, surrounded by towers of materials, laptops, tablets, books in a dozen languages, printed transcripts, notarized statements. Jeremy Banks, Daniel's public defender, looked almost relieved to let the real experts take over, hovering at the edge of the organized chaos, like someone who'd stumbled into a production far beyond his experience. At the prosecution table, Margaret Vance reviewed her notes with the focus of someone who knew her case was about to be challenged. She'd brought reinforcements, 2 junior prosecutors and a paralegal, all of them shuffling papers and conferring in urgent whispers. Judge Hammond entered, and everyone rose. He looked less amused than he had 3 days ago, more wary, like a man who'd started to suspect the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he'd thought. "Be seated," he said, settling into his chair. "We're here to review the findings of Dr. Sarah Chen regarding the defendant's linguistic capabilities. Dr. Chen, you have the floor." Chen stood, and Daniel noticed she'd dressed formally today. A charcoal suit, her hair pulled back severely, every inch the credentialed expert. She told him yesterday that presentation mattered, that they needed to speak the court's language of authority and legitimacy. "Thank you, Your Honor. Over the past 72 hours, Dr. Marcus Webb of Columbia University, and I have conducted the most comprehensive linguistic evaluation I've administered in 27 years of academic practice. We've tested Mr. Cross across 11 languages in multiple domains: conversational fluency, technical translation, cultural competency, improvisational usage, and historical knowledge. I've brought Dr. Webb to present our findings jointly, as his specialization in detecting linguistic fraud provides additional credibility to our conclusions." Hammond nodded slowly. "Proceed." Webb stood, clicked a remote, and the courtroom screen lit up with the first slide of their presentation. It showed Daniel's face alongside a simple title, Linguistic Evaluation, Daniel Cross. "Your Honor," Webb began, his academic tone lending weight to every word, "I came into this evaluation as a skeptic. I specialize in identifying fraudulent language claims, and I fully expected to expose Mr. Cross within the first hour. Instead, what I witnessed fundamentally challenged my understanding of adult language acquisition capacity." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a chart comparing standardized language proficiency levels. The Common European Framework of Reference defines C2 as the highest level of language mastery, complete fluency with native-like competency. Most adult learners never reach C2 in even one second language. Mr. Cross tests at C2 or above in 9 of his 11 claimed languages, and at C1, advanced proficiency, in the remaining 2. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Hammond leaned forward, his expression sharpening with interest. Chen took over, clicking through examples. "Let me demonstrate what C2 fluency actually means. Your Honor, I'm going to play a recording from our testing session. This is Mr. Cross translating a complex medical document from Mandarin to English, sight unseen, in real time." The audio filled the courtroom. Daniel's voice, steady and confident, rendered a dense paragraph about cardiovascular pathology with the kind of precision that required not just linguistic knowledge, but deep understanding of medical terminology in both languages. When the recording ended, Chen brought up the original Mandarin text alongside Daniel's English translation. I asked 3 separate medical translators to review this translation, Chen said. All 3 confirmed it's not just accurate, it's exceptionally well crafted. Mr. Cross didn't just translate words. He preserved medical precision while making the English accessible to non-specialist readers. That's graduate-level translation skill. She clicked through more examples. Daniel translating German legal contracts, Arabic poetry, Russian philosophical texts, Japanese business correspondence, each one accompanied by expert verification, each one demonstrating mastery that should have required years of formal study. But fluency alone doesn't tell the full story, Webb said, taking over again. What makes Mr. Cross's abilities truly remarkable is his cultural competency. Language isn't just vocabulary and grammar, it's embedded in cultural context, social hierarchies, regional variations. When we tested Mr. Cross, he didn't just speak these languages, he inhabited them. He played another audio clip, this time of Daniel analyzing a Korean business email and explaining how the writer's use of honorifics revealed their exact position in their company's hierarchy. Then a clip of Daniel discussing how different Spanish dialects reflected colonial history and social class. Then Daniel identifying a French speaker's regional origin based on subtle pronunciation patterns. This isn't textbook knowledge, Webb emphasized. This is the kind of intuitive cultural understanding that typically requires living in a country for years. Mr. Cross has it across multiple linguistic traditions. That's not fraud. That's extraordinary natural ability combined with unique developmental circumstances. Vance stood abruptly. Your Honor, while Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb's presentation is impressive, it doesn't address the central issue. Multiple clients have complained that Mr. Cross's translations were inaccurate. Are we supposed to ignore documented errors because he performed well on academic tests? We're getting to that, Mrs. Vance, Chen said, her tone sharp. And I think you'll find the documented errors tell a very different story than your prosecution suggests. She clicked to a new slide. Client complaints. Evidence review. We subpoenaed the original translation files from all 3 companies that filed complaints. Chen continued. We also obtained the source materials Mr. Cross was given to translate and the internal communications surrounding each complaint. What we found was illuminating. The screen showed an email chain from Global Tech Industries. Chen highlighted several messages in yellow. This is from Global Tech's VP of International Relations, dated 2 days before they complained about Mr. Cross's translation work. Quote, we have a problem. I verbally agreed to terms with Hoffman Industries that contradict our written contract. We need a way to explain this discrepancy without admitting I exceeded my authority. End quote. She let that sink in, then clicked to the next email. 3 hours later, their legal counsel responds. Suggest we claim translation error in the German contract. We can say the translator misrendered the liability clauses, cheaper than a lawsuit, and protects Johnson's position. That translator was Daniel Cross. The courtroom erupted. Journalists typed frantically. Spectators gasped. Hammond's gavel cracked like thunder. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. When the noise subsided, Chen continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. We had the original contract reviewed by 3 independent German legal translators. All 3 confirmed Mr. Cross's translation was completely accurate. Global Tech didn't fire him because of errors. They fired him to cover up their own executives' unauthorized promises. She clicked through more evidence. Internal emails from Hemisphere Consulting showing they'd knowingly violated Chinese environmental regulations and needed a scapegoat when caught. Communications from Patterson, Wyatt, and Cole revealing their client had made inflammatory political statements in Russian, then wanted to claim they'd been mistranslated when those statements caused diplomatic backlash. In every single case, Chen said, her voice rising with controlled fury, Mr. Cross's translations were accurate. The clients who complained about him weren't reporting errors. They were committing fraud themselves, using an independent contractor without credentials as a convenient scapegoat for their own misconduct. Vance was on her feet, her face flushed. Your Honor, these emails are taken out of context. Companies have legitimate reasons to review translation quality. Ms. Vance, Hammond interrupted, and his tone had changed completely. Did the prosecution review these communications before bringing charges? Vance hesitated. We relied on the client complaints as filed, Your Honor. These internal emails were not provided to us during discovery. Because we had to subpoena them, Chen interjected. The companies involved fought disclosure. They didn't want anyone seeing how they'd conspired to destroy Mr. Cross's reputation to hide their own liability. Hammond turned to his clerk. I want those companies' attorneys contacted immediately. If there's evidence of conspiracy to file false claims, I want prosecutors in those jurisdictions informed. He looked back at Chen. Continue, Doctor. Chen took a breath, visibly steadying herself. Your Honor, I'd like to address the fundamental injustice underlying this entire prosecution. Mr. Cross has been charged with fraud not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked credentials. The assumption, the automatic, unquestioned assumption, was that someone from his background couldn't possibly possess the expertise he claimed. That assumption is classist, it's wrong, and it nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. She clicked to a slide showing Daniel's background, son of a janitor, high school education, single father from a dying industrial town. If Daniel Cross had attended the right universities, earned the right degrees, had the right connections, his abilities would be celebrated. He'd be hired by prestigious firms, featured in linguistics journals, held up as a prodigy. But because he learned in the margins, because his teachers were children of diplomats, not professors with PhDs, his expertise was automatically suspect. But, Webb added, the linguistics community needs to reckon with this. We've created systems that validate certain paths to knowledge while dismissing others. Mr. Cross represents a category we've largely ignored, adult autodidacts with exceptional natural ability who acquire languages through immersive social learning rather than formal instruction. Our theories need to account for people like him, not dismiss them as impossible. Hammond was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, I'd like to hear from Mr. Cross directly. Mr. Cross, please approach the bench. Daniel stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath. Daniel placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down feeling like he was about to step off a cliff. Mr. Cross, Hammond said, and his voice had lost its earlier mockery. Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb have made a compelling case for your abilities. But I need to hear from you. I need to understand how someone in your position acquired these skills, not through expert testimony, in your own words. Daniel gripped the armrests of the witness chair, gathering his thoughts. The courtroom was absolutely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, waiting. Your Honor, he began, I grew up invisible. My father cleaned houses, which meant I existed in spaces where I was functionally furniture. People talked around me like I wasn't there. Had private conversations in languages they thought kept those conversations private. I realized early that being underestimated was a kind of power, as long as I actually became what they assumed I couldn't be. He saw Emma in the front row, her eyes locked on him, willing him forward. The children of the families my father worked for taught me because they were lonely, because their parents were busy with important things, because a 7-year-old doesn't care about credentials or social class. They taught me French and Russian and Mandarin because teaching was play, and I was there, and I listened like my life depended on remembering. His voice gained strength as he continued. But it wasn't just play. My father was documenting crimes, human trafficking specifically. He needed someone who could understand conversations in languages he didn't speak. So I became his translator when I was 11 years old. I listened to terrible things being discussed by people who thought a child couldn't understand, and I helped my father build a case that eventually freed dozens of trafficking victims and put 16 people in prison. The courtroom stirred. Several reporters looked up sharply, making connections they hadn't made before. Hammond's expression had shifted to something between shock and dawning realization. Operation Invisible Eye, he said quietly. That was 3 years ago. You were involved in that? My father and I provided most of the intelligence, Daniel confirmed. 26 years of documentation, conversations I translated, patterns we identified. The FBI told us our work was critical to breaking the case, but I asked to remain anonymous because I had a daughter to protect and a translation business I was trying to build. He looked directly at Hammond now, no longer afraid. Your Honor, you asked me 3 days ago how I learned 11 languages in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The answer is that I learned them the way most of the world learns languages, through immersion, relationship, necessity, and time. The only difference is that my immersion happened in living rooms and kitchens instead of classrooms. My teachers were children and refugees and people who existed in the same invisible spaces I did. That doesn't make the learning less legitimate. It just makes it less recognizable to institutions built around credentialism. Hammond was quiet, and in that silence, Daniel felt something shift. Not certainty, not yet, but the possibility of doubt. The possibility that everything the judge had assumed might be wrong. "Your Honor," Vance said, standing again, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Even if Mr. Cross's abilities are real, even if the client complaints were fabricated, that doesn't fully explain how he charged premium rates without proper credentials. There's still the question of misrepresentation." "What misrepresentation?" Chen cut in. "Mr. Cross never claimed to have degrees he didn't possess. His contracts explicitly stated his educational background. Clients hired him because his work was excellent and his rates were fair. The only misrepresentation here was companies lying about his work to avoid their own liability." Hammond held up a hand. "Ms. Vance, I'm going to ask you directly. Given what we've learned in this hearing, do you still believe federal fraud charges are appropriate in this case?" Vance looked at her notes, at her junior prosecutors, at the evidence that had been systematically dismantled over the past hour. Daniel could see her running calculations, weighing career implications, trying to find a path that didn't involve admitting the prosecution had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. "Your Honor," she said finally, "I would request a recess to review the new evidence and consult with my office." "Denied," Hammond said flatly. "You've had months to build this case. Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb gave you 72 hours. I want your answer now, counselor. Based on the evidence before this court, do these charges have merit?" Vance's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she stood frozen, caught between pride and pragmatism. Then she sat down slowly. "No, Your Honor. Based on the evidence presented, I do not believe we can prove fraud beyond reasonable doubt." The courtroom exploded. Cheers from the gallery, reporters rushing to file stories, Emma's voice crying "Dad" above the chaos. Hammond's gavel pounded repeatedly, but even he seemed reluctant to fully suppress the noise. "Order," he finally shouted. "We are not finished here." The noise subsided gradually. Hammond waited until complete silence returned before speaking again. "Mr. Cross, please remain at the witness stand. I have something to say, and I want you to hear it directly." Daniel's heart was racing, adrenaline and disbelief making everything feel surreal. He gripped the armrests again, steadying himself. Hammond took off his reading glasses, cleaned them slowly, put them back on. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Mr. Cross, 3 days ago I laughed at you in this courtroom. I dismissed your claims as absurd. I treated you with contempt based entirely on assumptions about what someone from your background could or couldn't accomplish. I was wrong. Profoundly, shamefully wrong." The judge looked older suddenly, the weight of his error visible in the lines around his eyes. "I've been a judge for 19 years. I've prided myself on fairness, on seeing through deception, on protecting the integrity of this court. But what I've demonstrated over the past week is that my judgment was clouded by bias I didn't even recognize I held. Bias against autodidacts, against people without formal credentials, against the possibility that extraordinary ability could emerge from ordinary circumstances." He looked out at the crowded courtroom. "This case should never have reached my courtroom. The charges were built on fabricated complaints from corporations protecting their own liability. But even more than that, they were built on a justice system that automatically assumes someone like Mr. Cross must be lying, while corporations with expensive lawyers must be telling the truth. That's not justice. That's institutional prejudice." Hammond turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Cross, I cannot undo the damage you've suffered. I cannot give you back the weeks you've spent in custody, the fear your daughter has experienced, the reputation you've lost. But I can make sure this record reflects the truth. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. The record will show that you were falsely accused, that your abilities are genuine, and that the complaints against you were fraudulent." He paused, then added, "Furthermore, I'm ordering the court to issue a public statement regarding this case. I want prosecutors in New York, Illinois, and Delaware, the jurisdictions where Global Tech, Hemisphere, and Patterson Wyatt are based, to investigate whether charges should be brought against those companies for conspiracy to file false claims. If they deliberately destroyed your career to hide their own misconduct, they should face consequences. Vance looked like she wanted to object, but she remained silent. Hammond wasn't finished. Dr. Chen, Dr. Webb, your work on this case exemplifies the best of expert testimony. You didn't just defend a client, you exposed systemic injustice. I hope you'll publish your findings. The legal and academic communities need to understand how badly we failed Mr. Cross, and how we can do better. Chen nodded, her eyes bright. Webb was already making notes, probably planning the paper that would reshape conversations about language acquisition and credentialism. Finally, Hammond said, looking directly at Daniel, Mr. Cross, I apologize, not just on behalf of this court, but personally. You deserve better than what you received here. Your father would be proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished linguistically, but for your integrity, your courage, and your refusal to accept injustice, even when the entire system was arrayed against you. Daniel's throat was too tight to speak. He nodded, not trusting his voice. This court is adjourned, Hammond said, and brought his gavel down one final time. The bailiff unlocked Daniel's handcuffs. The metal fell away, and for the first time in days, his wrists were free. He stood slowly, unsteady, as Emma broke through the gallery barrier and ran to him. He caught her, pulled her into his arms, buried his face in her hair while she sobbed against his shoulder. It's okay, baby, he whispered in English, then Mandarin, then Spanish, cycling through languages like incantations. It's over. We're okay. We're going home. Chen approached quietly, giving them space but waiting nearby. When Emma finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Daniel extended his hand to the professor. Thank you, he said. I don't know how to... You don't have to, Chen interrupted, shaking his hand firmly. Watching you vindicated is all the thanks I need, though I hope you'll let us publish your story. The world needs to understand what happened here. On one condition, Daniel said. We also tell the stories of all the other people like me. The ones with abilities no one believes, credentials no one values, expertise the system refuses to recognize. If my story can open doors for them, then yes, absolutely. Webb joined them, less comfortable with emotion, but clearly moved. Mr. Cross, I'd like to propose a collaboration. Georgetown and Columbia jointly studying your linguistic development, documenting your methods, using your case to challenge how we think about adult language acquisition. No exploitation. You'd be compensated as a research consultant. Interested? Daniel looked at Emma, who was still holding his hand like she might never let go. He thought about his father's journals, about all the invisible people who'd shaped his life, about the possibility of turning his hardest experiences into something that might help others. Yeah, he said. I'm interested. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Daniel, Emma, Chen, Webb, and even Jeremy Banks, who'd barely contributed but looked relieved it was over, reporters swarmed them. Cameras flashed. Questions came from every direction. Chen stepped forward, naturally assuming the role of spokesperson. We'll be making a full statement tomorrow. For now, I'll just say this. Daniel Cross is an innocent man who was prosecuted for possessing abilities that made powerful people uncomfortable. His vindication should make us all question how we determine expertise, who we believe, and what we're missing when we only value credentials over actual competency. One reporter shouted, Mr. Cross, what's next for you? Daniel paused, considering. What was next? Rebuilding his business, processing trauma, figuring out how to explain all of this to a 12-year-old who just watched her father nearly go to prison for being extraordinary. But also something more. Something his father had started and Daniel had continued and maybe, finally, could complete properly. Justice, he said simply. My father spent his life documenting crimes because he believed invisible people had a responsibility to witness. I'm going to finish his work. Make sure his story and the stories of everyone he tried to help don't get forgotten. As they pushed through the crowd toward the courthouse doors, Daniel felt sun on his face for the first time in days. The light was bright enough to make him squint, warm enough to remind him that the world outside detention centers and courtrooms still existed. Emma squeezed his hand. Ziyu, she said, freedom in Mandarin. Ti. Ziyu, he agreed and pulled her close as they walked down the courthouse steps together, finally heading home. Behind them, still in the courtroom, Judge Hammond sat alone at the bench. He'd dismissed his clerk, sent everyone away, and now he stared at the empty room where he'd nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. He thought about all the cases he'd presided over, all the defendants he'd judged, and wondered how many other Daniel Crosses had stood before him while he'd been too blind to see them. He pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Not a judgment, not a ruling, but something he should have written years ago. A letter to the Judicial Ethics Board requesting training on recognizing class bias in courtroom decision-making, requesting changes to how expert qualifications were evaluated, requesting that someone, somewhere, make sure what had happened to Daniel Cross could never happen again. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a start. And sometimes, Hammond thought, that's all anyone could ask for: the humility to recognize failure and the courage to try to do better. The courtroom lights dimmed automatically as evening approached, casting long shadows across empty benches where so much had nearly gone wrong and, against all odds, had somehow gone right. The apartment looked exactly as Daniel had left it 3 weeks ago, yet somehow completely foreign. Emma's backpack still hung on the hook by the door. Dishes sat in the drying rack. A half-finished puzzle covered the coffee table, a map of the world they'd been working on together, identifying countries in their native languages. Normal life, frozen in time, waiting for them to step back into it like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Daniel set his belongings down: a plastic bag containing the clothes he'd worn to court, documents from his release, Dr. Chen's business card with her personal cell number written on the back. Emma had already disappeared into her room, and he could hear her moving things around, reclaiming her space after 3 weeks of staying with Mrs. Palmer. He walked to the window and looked out at Millbrook's main street, the hardware store where he'd worked, the diner where he and Emma got breakfast on Saturdays, the public library where he'd spent countless hours reading, teaching himself grammar rules from textbooks written in languages he was already fluent in, trying to understand the mechanics of what came to him naturally. This small town had shaped him, limited him, and now he wasn't sure if he could stay here or if staying would feel like accepting those limits all over again. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Chen. Media requests coming in. CNN, NPR, Washington Post all want interviews. Your call on whether to engage. But Daniel, your story matters. Think about it. He stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. 3 weeks ago, he'd been desperate for anyone to listen. Now everyone wanted to hear what he had to say, and the attention felt overwhelming, like standing in a spotlight after years in shadow. Emma emerged from her room, changed into comfortable clothes, her hair down. She looked older than she had 3 weeks ago, like she'd aged months in the time he'd been gone. "Dad?" Her voice was small. "Is it really over, or are they going to come back?" Daniel crossed the room and pulled her into a hug. "It's really over, sweetheart. The charges are dismissed with prejudice, which means they can't be brought again. We're safe." "But those companies," Emma said, her voice muffled against his chest, "the ones who lied about you, what happens to them?" "The judge ordered investigations. If they broke laws, they'll face consequences." "Good." Emma pulled back, and there was something fierce in her expression that reminded Daniel of her mother. Sarah had never backed down from injustice, either. "They should pay for what they did to you, to us." Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock at the door. He tensed instinctively. 3 weeks of hypervigilance didn't disappear in an afternoon, but when he looked through the peephole, he saw a familiar face. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI, dressed in civilian clothes, no badge visible. He opened the door. "Agent Martinez." "Mr. Cross." She offered a professional smile, but there was warmth in it. "I heard about the dismissal. I wanted to come personally to say congratulations, and to return something that belongs to you." She held out a cardboard box, unsealed, marked with evidence tags that had been officially voided. Daniel took it, his heart suddenly pounding, because he knew what was inside before he opened it. His father's journals, all 43 of them. "The Bureau finished our review," Martinez said quietly. "Your father's documentation was extraordinary, meticulous. Without it, Operation Invisible Eye would never have succeeded. We wanted you to have these back. They belong to you and your daughter. Daniel set the box down carefully on the coffee table, his hands unsteady. Emma came to stand beside him, looking down at the worn notebooks that represented her grandfather's life work. "There's something else," Martinez continued. "Can we talk? Privately?" Daniel glanced at Emma, who nodded and retreated to her room without being asked. Smart kid. She knew when adult conversations needed privacy. When Emma's door closed, Martinez sat in the armchair Daniel offered. She looked tired, Daniel noticed, like she'd been working long hours on something difficult. "We've been investigating how the charges against you originated," she said without preamble. "Who had the resources and motivation to coordinate complaints from 3 separate companies, to manipulate evidence, to push a federal prosecution forward. It wasn't random, Mr. Cross. Someone with serious connections wanted you destroyed." Daniel's stomach tightened. "You know who?" "We have suspicions, strong ones, but no proof we can take to court yet." Martinez leaned forward, her expression grave. "Do you remember Viktor Kozlov?" The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. He sat down heavily on the couch. He was arrested in Operation Invisible Eye, 10-year sentence for trafficking and racketeering. He was released 8 months ago on a technicality. His lawyer found procedural errors in how evidence was collected. The conviction was overturned and Kozlov walked free. Martinez's voice was tight with frustration. "We've been monitoring him since his release. He's been reaching out to old contacts, rebuilding his network. And 6 months ago, right around when your legal troubles started, he had several meetings with corporate attorneys from the firms that later filed complaints against you." Daniel felt cold. "He figured out I was involved in gathering intelligence." "We think so. Your father kept his documentation anonymous, but Kozlov's smart. He probably put pieces together. Joseph Cross maintained the Thornberry estate. Joseph Cross died right before the raids, and then a translator named Cross with extraordinary abilities started having very convenient legal problems." Martinez paused. "He couldn't come after you directly without exposing himself, but he could destroy your reputation, your livelihood, make sure you were too preoccupied with survival to be a threat." "And now," Daniel asked, "the charges are dismissed. He knows I'm free. What's stopping him from trying again?" "Publicity," Martinez said bluntly. "Your case is about to go national. You're being portrayed as the innocent man nearly destroyed by corporate conspiracy and judicial bias. If anything happens to you now, Kozlov becomes the obvious suspect. He's ruthless, but he's not stupid. The spotlight is your protection." "That's why Dr. Chen wants me to do interviews." Understanding clicked into place. "Not just to tell my story, to make sure I'm too visible to quietly eliminate." "Smart man." Martinez stood. "I can't officially advise you either way, but unofficially, tell your story. Tell it loud and tell it everywhere. Make sure the entire country knows your name and face, because right now, that's the best security you have." After she left, Daniel sat with the box of journals, not opening them, just resting his hand on the cardboard. His father had lived in the margins, documented crimes from the shadows, and died thinking his work was done. But the people he'd helped expose were still out there, still dangerous, still capable of reaching across years and institutions to punish anyone who'd crossed them. Emma emerged from her room. "I was listening," she admitted. "I know I shouldn't have, but I wanted to know what was happening." "It's okay." Daniel wasn't going to lie to her. She'd earned the truth. "Some dangerous people might still be angry at me. At us. The FBI thinks doing interviews, being public about what happened, will keep us safe." "Then we should do it," Emma said firmly. "We should tell everyone what happened, about Grandpa, about the trafficking, about everything." "Sweetheart, that would put you in the spotlight too. Reporters would want to talk to you, photograph you. Your life would change." "It already changed, Dad. It changed when they arrested you. It changed when I had to visit you in jail. It changed when I watched you prove to a whole courtroom that you're not a liar." Emma's voice was steady, older than her 12 years. "If telling our story keeps us safe and helps other people, then that's what we should do." Daniel looked at his daughter, this fierce, brilliant girl who'd inherited her mother's courage and her grandfather's sense of justice. He pulled out his phone and texted Dr. Chen. "Let's do the interviews. All of them. But I want control over the narrative. We tell the full story, or we don't tell it at all." The response came within seconds. Agreed. I'll coordinate. First interview is CNN tomorrow morning if you're ready. National audience. Are you? Daniel typed back, "We're ready." The next 36 hours were a blur of preparation. Dr. Chen arrived at the apartment with Dr. Webb and a media consultant named Patricia Reeves, a woman in her 50s who'd handled crisis communications for everyone from whistleblowers to exonerated prisoners. She sat Daniel down at his own kitchen table and gave him the most practical advice he'd heard in weeks. "You're going to be angry during these interviews," Patricia said. "Angry at the judge who mocked you, angry at the companies who destroyed your reputation, angry at a system that assumed you were guilty because you didn't have the right credentials. That anger is valid, but it can't be your only note." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "I mean, if you go on national television just venting rage, you'll be dismissed as bitter. But if you channel that anger into clear explanation of systemic problems, if you talk about your father and the invisible people who deserve to be seen, if you make people understand that this isn't just about you, but about everyone the system fails, then you become a voice for change instead of just a victim seeking vindication." She pulled out a notepad. "Let's talk about your father. Tell me about Joseph Cross, not as evidence in a case, but as a person." Daniel talked for an hour, and somewhere in the middle of describing his father's quiet dedication, his careful documentation, his belief that invisible people had a responsibility to witness, he started to cry. Not from sadness, exactly, but from the release of finally being able to honor his father's work publicly, to say out loud what Joseph Cross had given his life to accomplish. Patricia didn't tell him to stop crying. She just handed him tissues and kept taking notes. When he finished, she said, "That's your story. That's what you lead with. Not the legal battle, not the linguistics. Those are supporting details. The story is about a janitor who saw crimes no one else noticed and a son who inherited his father's courage. That's what people will remember." The CNN interview was scheduled for the next morning, live from their studio in Washington. Daniel and Emma took the train down, accompanied by Dr. Chen, who'd agreed to appear as his expert witness. The green room felt surreal. Comfortable chairs, bottled water, a TV showing the previous segment where a senator was discussing infrastructure bills. Normal. Professional. A world Daniel had only ever seen from the outside. A producer came to prep them. Friendly but efficient, explaining the segment structure, where to look, how to address the host. Emma sat beside Daniel, remarkably calm, her hand in his. "You nervous, sweetheart?" he asked quietly. "Yeah, but Grandpa was probably nervous every time he wrote in those journals, knowing what he was documenting. And you were nervous in court. Being nervous doesn't mean we stop." The producer overheard and smiled. "Smart kid. You're going to do great." The studio was smaller than it looked on TV, all focused lights and camera angles designed to create the illusion of expansive space. The host, Amanda Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, though they joked about it, greeted them warmly and genuinely. She'd done her homework, asked intelligent questions during the pre-interview, and seemed actually invested in telling the story right. 30 seconds, a voice called from the darkness beyond the lights. Daniel took a deep breath. Emma squeezed his hand. Dr. Chen, sitting just off camera, gave him an encouraging nod. "And we're live in 5, 4, 3. Amanda looked directly into the camera, her expression serious and engaged. "Welcome back. Tonight we're talking with Daniel Cross, a man who was nearly destroyed by the American justice system for possessing abilities no one believed he could have. His story raises profound questions about credentialism, class bias, and what we miss when we only value institutional validation. Daniel, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," Daniel said, and his voice was steady. "Let's start at the beginning. You grew up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the son of a night janitor. Tell us how a child in those circumstances learns to speak 11 languages fluently." Daniel had practiced this answer, but he didn't use his prepared words. Instead, he talked from his heart. About his father taking him to work. About children who taught him their languages because teaching was play. About being invisible in spaces where powerful people spoke freely. About his mother's death and how languages became his way of holding on to relationships. "People think language learning is about classrooms and textbooks," he said. "But that's just one way. I learned the way most of the world learns, through immersion, through relationship, through necessity. The only difference is my immersion happened in living rooms instead of lecture halls. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. But when you tried to use these abilities professionally, you faced systematic rejection. Why? Because I didn't have credentials. No degree, no certifications, just ability. And in America, we've built systems that trust paperwork more than performance. Companies would hire me, see that my translations were perfect, then panic when they realized I'd never been to university. They couldn't reconcile who I was with what I could do. And some of those companies did more than panic, Amanda said. They actively conspired to destroy your career. Can you explain what happened? Daniel walked through it methodically. Global Tech using him as a scapegoat. Hemisphere and Patterson Wyatt following suit. The systematic destruction of his reputation. The federal charges built on fabricated complaints. He kept his tone factual, letting the facts speak their own outrage. These weren't honest mistakes, he said. These were corporations with expensive lawyers deliberately targeting an independent contractor who lacked the resources to fight back. They assumed I'd be easy to destroy because people like me, people without institutional backing, usually are. But you weren't destroyed? Amanda said. Dr. Sarah Chen, you intervened in Mr. Cross's bail hearing. What made you get involved? Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression passionate. I saw a pattern I've seen too many times in academia. Someone with extraordinary natural ability being dismissed because they didn't follow the approved path. We claim to value merit, but what we actually value is credentialing. Daniel Cross has abilities I've spent my career studying, yet the system assumed he must be fraudulent because he learned in the margins instead of in classrooms. And when you tested him? Amanda asked. I found one of the most remarkable autodidacts I've ever encountered. Not just fluent, but culturally competent across multiple linguistic traditions. The kind of ability that appears maybe once in a generation. And he nearly went to prison for it because no one would believe someone from his background could be that exceptional. The interview continued for another 15 minutes. Daniel talked about his father's journals, about Operation Invisible Eye, about the trafficking victims whose stories deserve to be remembered. Emma spoke briefly, with poise that made Daniel's chest ache with pride, about what it was like to watch her father fight for truth while the world called him a liar. When it was over, when the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, Amanda came around the desk and shook Daniel's hand. That was powerful. Important. I hope it reaches the people who need to hear it. Me too, Daniel said. They did 6 more interviews over the next week. NPR's Fresh Air, where the host engaged deeply with the linguistics and systemic bias angles. The Washington Post, which ran a front-page profile with photos of Daniel and Emma. A segment on 60 Minutes that tracked down some of the children who'd originally taught Daniel languages. Alexandra Vandermeer, now a diplomat in Paris, who remembered the janitor's son and was delighted to learn what he'd become. Each interview brought new responses. Letters from other autodidacts sharing their own stories of being dismissed by institutional gatekeepers. Messages from trafficking survivors thanking Daniel for honoring his father's work. Job offers from companies who wanted to hire someone with his abilities, who didn't care about credentials. But the most unexpected response came from Judge Richard Hammond. Daniel was home with Emma, sorting through the overwhelming volume of correspondence when his phone rang from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Cross, this is Richard Hammond. Daniel froze. Emma looked up from the letter she was reading, her expression alarmed. Judge Hammond, Daniel said carefully. I know I have no right to call you directly. If you want to hang up, I'll understand. But I watched your CNN interview, and I need to say something beyond my courtroom apology. Hammond's voice was quiet, stripped of judicial authority. I've been a judge for 19 years, and I've never been more wrong about a defendant than I was about you. What I did, the mockery, the dismissiveness, the absolute certainty that you were lying, that was an abuse of my position. It was cruel, and it reflected biases I should have recognized and checked years ago. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was trying to reconcile this humbled voice with the man who'd laughed at him from the bench. Hammond continued. I've submitted myself for disciplinary review. I've requested mandatory training on recognizing class bias in judicial decision-making. And I've started working with the National Council of Judges to develop protocols for preventing what happened to you from happening to others. None of that excuses what I did. But I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Because you deserve to know that your story changed something, changed someone. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can make sure I never cause that kind of damage again. Hammond paused. Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man. You've honored his legacy well. After Hammond hung up, Daniel sat in silence for a long moment. Emma came to sit beside him. Was that really the judge? She asked. Yeah. Is he sorry? I think he is. Good, Emma said. He should be? 3 weeks after the CNN interview, Dr. Chen called with unexpected news. Daniel, I've been talking with Georgetown and Columbia. We want to create something new, a program for adults with exceptional autodidactic abilities, people like you who've been locked out of traditional academic paths. Full scholarships, recognition of experiential learning, pathways to legitimate credentials that honor non-traditional education. And we want you to help design it. Why me? Daniel asked. I'm not an academic. Exactly. You understand what it's like to be excluded from these systems. Who better to help us fix them? Chen's enthusiasm was palpable. We're calling it the Joseph Cross Fellowship, if you'll allow us to use your father's name. The first cohort would start next fall. 10 students, full support, a chance to prove that ability matters more than pedigree. Daniel thought about his father, documenting crimes in careful handwriting, about all the invisible people who saw everything but were never seen themselves, about the possibility of creating doors for others like him. Yes, he said, absolutely yes. The fellowship announcement made news too, another chapter in the story that had captured national attention. Daniel found himself speaking at universities, consulting with companies about how to evaluate ability versus credentials, testifying before legislative committees about reforming professional licensing requirements. But the work that mattered most happened quietly, in his apartment with his father's journals spread across the table. Agent Martinez had been right. Kozlov was still out there, still dangerous. But there were other people in those journals too, victims who'd been trafficked through Millbrook and then disappeared into the system. People whose stories Joseph Cross had documented, but who'd never received justice. Daniel started reaching out to them, one by one, using his languages to contact them wherever they'd ended up, Moscow, Manila, Sao Paulo, letting them know that someone had witnessed what happened to them, that their suffering hadn't been invisible, asking if they wanted to tell their stories, to help finish the work his father had started. Some didn't respond. Some told him to leave them alone, that they'd rebuilt their lives and couldn't revisit trauma. But some said yes. Some said they'd been waiting for someone to ask, someone to care, someone to prove that they mattered. 4 months after his exoneration, Daniel sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters with Agent Martinez, Dr. Chen, and 7 trafficking survivors his father had documented in his journals. They were building a new case, a comprehensive one, using Joseph's documentation combined with current testimony, going after not just Kozlov, but the entire network that had operated for decades in plain sight. This is going to take years, Martinez warned. These are powerful people with serious resources. My father spent 26 years on this, Daniel said. I can be patient. One of the survivors, a woman named Elena, who'd been trafficked from Ukraine when she was 17 and was now a social worker in Boston, spoke up. Your father's journals saved my life, not just because they helped get me rescued, but because when I read them years later, when Agent Martinez showed them to me, I realized someone had seen me, really seen me. When I thought I was nothing, invisible, disposable, someone noticed and wrote down my story like it mattered. She looked at Daniel directly. That's what your father gave us, proof that we mattered, that we were human beings worth remembering. So whatever time this takes, however long we have to fight, I'm in. We all are. The others nodded agreement. 7 people from 6 countries, bound together by trauma and Joseph Cross's careful witness, ready to make sure their stories became evidence instead of remaining secrets. That night, Daniel came home to find Emma at the kitchen table, working on homework. French verb conjugations. She looked up when he entered. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were in jail, when everyone thought you were lying, how did you keep believing you were telling the truth? How did you not start doubting yourself? Daniel sat down across from her, considering the question carefully. Honestly, there were moments I did doubt. When everyone you respect tells you you're wrong, it's hard not to wonder if maybe they're right. But then I'd think about all the people who taught me, Alexandra, Katya, David, Rabbi Goldstein, all of them. I'd remember their voices, their languages, the parts of themselves they gave me, and I knew that was real. It didn't matter if anyone else believed it. I knew. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to learn more languages, not just the ones you're teaching me. I want to learn like you did, from people, from relationships, from actually caring about the humans behind the words. Why? Daniel asked, though he thought he knew. Because Grandpa used his invisibility to witness. You use your languages to connect and fight for people. And I want to do something like that too, something that matters. She met his eyes steadily. I want to finish what you and Grandpa started, together. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. Then that's what we'll do, he said. Together. Outside their small apartment window, Millbrook's main street was quiet in the evening darkness. The same town where Daniel had grown up invisible, where his father had cleaned houses and documented crimes, where languages had become armor and weapon and memorial all at once. The same town, but different now. Different because people knew their story. Different because invisible people were finally being seen. And in that small apartment, a father and daughter made plans to honor a legacy built in margins and shadows, to make sure that witnessing led to justice and justice led to change. The work was just beginning. But for the first time in his life, Daniel Cross wasn't fighting alone. 3 years passed like water finding its level, settling into new patterns, carving new channels through landscape that had seemed permanent and unchangeable. Daniel stood in the auditorium at Georgetown University, watching the first cohort of Joseph Cross Fellows receive their certificates, and felt his father's presence so strongly it was almost physical. 10 students from 10 different backgrounds, a former housekeeper from Honduras, a cab driver from Cairo, a night shift security guard from Seoul. All of them possessing extraordinary abilities that traditional academia had dismissed or ignored. All of them now credentialed, validated, ready to prove that talent didn't require the right zip code or the right last name. Dr. Chen stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. 3 years ago, we launched this fellowship with a radical premise, that ability matters more than pedigree, that lived experience can be as valuable as formal instruction, and that the people society overlooks often possess gifts we desperately need. These 10 individuals have proven that premise beyond any doubt. They've excelled in every metric we use to measure academic success, while also bringing perspectives and insights that make our entire institution stronger. Emma, now 15 and sitting in the front row, caught Daniel's eye and grinned. She'd grown taller, her features sharpening into young adulthood, but she still had that fierce expression that reminded him of Sarah. She'd become fluent in 9 languages herself now, learning the way he'd taught her, through people, through connection, through treating language as relationship rather than subject matter. After the ceremony, Daniel was surrounded by fellows wanting to thank him, to share their stories, to tell him what the program meant. Maria, the housekeeper from Honduras who'd been rejected by this same university 4 years ago, was now pursuing her PhD in linguistics and working with Dr. Webb on research about non-traditional language acquisition. My mother called me last week, Maria told Daniel, her eyes bright. She's been cleaning houses in Tegucigalpa for 30 years. I told her about the fellowship, about how we're studying people like her, people who learn languages because they need to understand the families they work for. She cried, Mr. Cross. She said someone finally thinks we matter. That's what your father's legacy means. It tells people they matter. Daniel hugged her, this brilliant woman who'd almost been lost to the world because she'd learned in margins instead of classrooms, and felt the weight of 3 years of work settling into something like peace. The trafficking case had taken those 3 years to build. Daniel, Elena, and the other survivors had worked with Agent Martinez and a team of federal prosecutors to construct a comprehensive case against not just Viktor Kozlov, but the entire network that had operated for decades. The trial had started 2 months ago in federal court in New York, and the evidence, built on Joseph Cross's careful documentation combined with current testimony, was overwhelming. Daniel's phone buzzed, a text from Martinez. "Verdict is in, courtroom in 1 hour. Can you make it?" He showed Emma the message. She nodded immediately. "We should be there, for Grandpa." They took the train to New York, arriving at the courthouse with 20 minutes to spare. The courtroom was packed with victims, advocates, journalists, and FBI agents who'd worked the case. Martinez met them at the entrance, looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "How are you feeling?" she asked Daniel. "Nervous. Your case was solid, but juries are unpredictable," Martinez finished. "I know. But Daniel, we've got testimony from 17 victims, your father's journals corroborating every pattern we identified, financial records showing money laundering, communications proving conspiracy. If they don't convict, it won't be because we didn't prove it." They filed into the courtroom and took seats in the gallery. Kozlov sat at the defense table, his expensive suit and impassive expression a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit Daniel remembered from Operation Invisible Eye. Beside him, 5 co-defendants, corporate executives, lawyers, a former diplomatic official, all of them well-dressed, well-connected, the kind of people who'd spent their lives believing they were untouchable. The judge entered. Everyone rose, then settled back into tense silence as the jury filed in. Daniel tried to read their faces, searching for some sign of how they'd decided, but they gave nothing away. The judge looked in the jury foreman, a middle-aged black woman who'd been taking meticulous notes throughout the trial. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, how do you find the defendant, Victor Kozlov?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Daniel heard Emma gasp beside him, felt her grab his hand. Martinez closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her features. The foreman continued through all the charges, all the defendants. "Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." The word repeated like a drumbeat, like justice finally catching up to people who'd evaded it for decades. When the judge gavelled for order and began discussing sentencing dates, Daniel looked around the courtroom at the survivors who'd testified. Elena was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking. A man named Jose, who'd been trafficked from the Philippines as a teenager and was now a nurse in San Francisco, sat with his head in his hands. They'd all revisited trauma to be here, to speak truth, to make sure Joseph Cross's documentation became more than just notebooks in an evidence box. Outside the courthouse, on the steps where Daniel had stood 3 years ago after his own exoneration, the survivors gathered together. The media swarmed, but Martinez's team kept them at a respectful distance while the group had a moment to themselves. Elena spoke first, her voice steady despite tears. "Joseph Cross saw us when we were invisible. He wrote down our stories when we thought no one cared. Daniel finished what his father started, and now the people who hurt us are going to prison. That's not just justice. That's proof that invisible people matter, that our lives are worth fighting for." Jose added, "My mother used to tell me that suffering in silence was the price of survival. That people like us, poor people, immigrant people, people without power, we just had to accept what happened to us. But Joseph Cross didn't accept it. He documented it. He witnessed it. And his son made sure that witness became justice." Daniel started to speak, but found his throat too tight. Emma squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, grateful for her steadiness. One of the prosecutors approached the group, a woman named Catherine Morrison, who'd led the case with fierce dedication. "I want you all to know something. This verdict changes precedent. We've established that corporate executives can be held criminally liable for trafficking operations they facilitate, even if they claim ignorance of ground-level crimes. That's going to make it easier to prosecute similar cases going forward. Your courage to testify didn't just put these specific people in prison, it created tools to go after others like them." "How long?" Daniel asked. "The sentences?" Kozlov's looking at life without parole, given his prior conviction and the scope of the conspiracy. The others probably 25 to 40 years each. They're old men. They'll die in prison. Morrison's expression was grim satisfaction. "Your father's journals were cited 63 times in the verdict. The jury told us afterward that his documentation was the most compelling evidence. They said you could feel his moral clarity in every entry, his determination to make sure these crimes were recorded, even when he couldn't stop them in real time. After the media dispersed and the survivors began heading their separate ways, Daniel and Emma walked to a small park near the courthouse. They sat on a bench, neither speaking for several minutes, just processing everything that had happened. Emma finally broke the silence. "Dad? Do you think Grandpa knew? When he was writing all those journals, documenting everything, do you think he knew it would lead to this?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think he hoped. I think he documented because he believed truth mattered, even if justice was slow. He used to tell me, 'Son, we might not see the harvest, but we plant the seeds anyway.' This verdict, it's the harvest of seeds he planted 26 years ago." "I want to plant seeds too," Emma said. "I've been thinking about what to do after high school. I don't want to just study languages. I want to use them the way you and Grandpa did, to witness, to fight for people." "What are you thinking?" "International human rights law. Dr. Chen knows people at Georgetown's law program. They have a concentration in trafficking and exploitation. I could learn the legal frameworks, combine that with languages, work with organizations that help survivors." Emma's voice gained confidence as she spoke. "There are so many people like Elena and Jose, people who've been hurt and then ignored. Someone needs to fight for them with tools the system actually respects." Daniel looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited her grandfather's sense of justice, her mother's courage, and whatever gift he'd passed along for seeing people the world tried to render invisible. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said quietly. "I am so proud of you." They sat together as afternoon faded into evening, watching New York rush past them, this city where justice had finally caught up to people who'd thought they were beyond its reach. 2 weeks later, Daniel received a call from Judge Richard Hammond. They'd stayed in occasional contact over the past 3 years, Hammond updating Daniel on judicial training programs he'd helped develop, Daniel sharing news about the fellowship. The relationship was complicated, still colored by the memory of mockery and bias, but it had evolved into something like mutual respect. "Daniel, I have a proposition," Hammond said. "The National Council of Judges is hosting a conference on recognizing and correcting bias in judicial decision-making. We want you to be our keynote speaker. We want you to tell your story directly to 500 sitting judges and show them what bias looks like from the defendant's perspective." Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. Speaking to a room full of judges about how they'd failed him felt like volunteering to relive trauma. But then he thought about all the other people who'd stood in courtrooms facing judges who'd already decided they were guilty, who'd never believe their truth, who'd see only deficits instead of abilities. "I'll do it," Daniel said, "but I want to bring some of the Joseph Cross Fellows with me. I want those judges to meet people they might have dismissed, to understand what they miss when they only value credentials." "Even better," Hammond agreed. "We'll make it happen." The conference was held in Chicago 3 months later. Daniel stood backstage with Maria, with 2 other fellows, David Kim, the former security guard, and Amara Okafor, a refugee from Nigeria who taught herself 5 languages while working her way through community college. They were all nervous, but there was determination too, a shared understanding that this opportunity mattered. When Daniel walked onto the stage and saw 500 judges looking back at him, he felt a moment of vertigo. These were the gatekeepers, the people with power to destroy lives or redeem them, and they held that power with such certainty that questioning their own judgment felt almost impossible. He started not with his own story, but with his father's. Joseph Cross was a night janitor for 26 years. Most of the people whose homes he cleaned never knew his name. He was functionally invisible, someone who existed in their spaces but not in their consciousness. What they didn't know was that invisibility gave him a particular kind of vision. He saw crimes happening in plain sight because people with power never thought someone like him was paying attention. Daniel walked the judges through his father's work, through the careful documentation, through the trafficking network that operated for decades, because the people who could have stopped it never looked closely at what the janitor might be witnessing. "My father taught me that invisible people see everything. But he also taught me that seeing isn't enough. Someone has to believe what we see. Someone has to take our witness seriously." Daniel paused, letting the words land. 3 years ago, I stood in a federal courtroom facing fraud charges. The evidence against me was fabricated. My abilities were real. But the judge, a good man, an experienced jurist, laughed at me. He'd already decided I was a liar because someone from my background couldn't possibly possess the expertise I claimed. He saw some judges shifting uncomfortably. Good. They should be uncomfortable. That judge is here today, Daniel continued. Judge Hammond asked to attend this conference specifically so he could model accountability. He spent 3 years examining his own biases, developing training programs, working to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others. That's courage. That's growth. And it's what I'm asking all of you to consider, not whether you have biases, because we all do, but whether you're brave enough to recognize them and change. He brought up the fellows one by one. Maria talked about being rejected from graduate programs despite demonstrating fluent Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Mayan Quiche. David described being dismissed from translation positions because he'd learned Korean and Japanese while working nights at a tech company, picking up languages from the engineers he guarded. Amara shared her experience of learning French, Arabic, Hausa, and Yoruba as a matter of survival, then being told those weren't academic languages when she tried to earn credit for them. Every person on this stage has abilities your institutions didn't believe in, Daniel said. We've all faced gatekeepers who valued credentials over competence, who assumed that learning only counts if it happens in approved ways. Some of us fought through and found opportunities anyway, but how many others didn't? How many extraordinary people did you send to prison, deny justice to, or simply ignore because they didn't fit your assumptions about what expertise looks like? The silence in the auditorium was profound. Daniel could see judges taking notes, others staring at the stage with expressions ranging from recognition to discomfort to something that might have been shame. I'm not asking you to lower standards, Daniel concluded. I'm asking you to examine what you count as evidence of meeting those standards. I'm asking you to consider that the person standing in front of you might be extraordinary in ways your credentialing systems never measured. I'm asking you to look at invisible people and actually see them. The standing ovation surprised him. It started with Judge Hammond, who rose to his feet at the back of the auditorium and spread through the room until all 500 judges were on their feet. Daniel stood there, overwhelmed, thinking about his father, who'd never received recognition like this, who died thinking his work was finished when really it was just beginning. After the conference, Hammond approached Daniel privately. Thank you, he said simply, for giving me the chance to be better, for not writing me off as irredeemable. We're all capable of being better, Daniel replied. My father used to say that recognizing you were wrong is harder than being right in the first place. You recognized it. That matters. 6 months later, Daniel sat in Dr. Chen's office at Georgetown, reviewing applications for the next Joseph Cross Fellowship cohort. They'd expanded the program, 30 fellows now instead of 10, with partner programs launching at Columbia, Berkeley, and University of Chicago. The model was spreading, forcing academic institutions to reconsider how they identified and valued talent. Look at this one, Dr. Chen said, sliding an application across the desk. Refugee from Myanmar. Speaks 7 languages. Been working as a hotel cleaner in Seattle for 10 years. Taught herself advanced mathematics through YouTube videos and library books. Applied to every university in Washington state and was rejected from all of them. Daniel read through the application, seeing echoes of his own story, of Maria's, of countless others whose gifts the system couldn't recognize. She's in, he said. Absolutely in. They worked through applications for another hour, building a cohort that represented everything the fellowship stood for. People with extraordinary abilities who'd been locked out by traditional gatekeeping, who'd learned in margins and shadows, who deserved the chance to prove that ability transcended credentials. When they finished, Chen leaned back in her chair and smiled. You know what I love about this? We're not just changing individual lives. We're forcing entire institutions to question their assumptions. Every fellow who succeeds, who publishes research or lands prestigious positions, or simply excels in ways the system said was impossible, each one of them proves that our old models were too narrow. My father would have loved seeing this, Daniel said. He spent his life making invisible people visible in his journals. Now we're doing it through institutional change. Speaking of your father, Chen said, pulling out another document. "I've been contacted by a publisher. They want to publish Joseph Cross's journals, properly edited and annotated, with context about the trafficking case, the trial, everything that came after. They're offering a significant advance, all of which would go to a foundation supporting trafficking survivors. They want your approval." Daniel took the document, scanning through the proposal. His first instinct was protectiveness. Those journals were personal, intimate records of his father's life. But then he thought about Elena's words, proof that invisible people matter. Publishing the journals would make his father's witness permanent, available to researchers, advocates, anyone fighting similar battles. "Yes," he said, "with one condition. We include interviews with the survivors who testified. Their voices need to be part of this story, not just my father's observations." "Already planned for," Chen said, smiling. "The publisher wants this to be a comprehensive record. Your father's documentation, the survivors' testimonies, the legal case, the aftermath. They're calling it Invisible Witness, How a Janitor's Journals Changed Everything." Daniel felt his eyes burning with unexpected tears. He would have hated the attention. Maybe, but he would have loved that it helped people. That's what mattered to him, right? Not recognition, but impact. That evening, Daniel came home to find Emma at the kitchen table, working on college applications. She'd been accepted to Georgetown's early decision program for international relations, with plans to continue to their law school. She looked up when he entered, her expression excited. "Dad, I got an email from the human rights organization I've been volunteering with. They want me to help translate testimony for an upcoming tribunal, trafficking survivors from Southeast Asia. They said my Tagalog and Khmer are good enough for preliminary interviews, and they'll pair me with experienced translators for official proceedings." Daniel sat down across from her, pride swelling in his chest. "That's incredible, sweetheart. When?" "This summer, before I start college. 2 months in Thailand, working with the legal team." Emma's eyes shone with purpose. "I know it's going to be hard hearing those stories, but Grandpa listened to hard stories for 26 years because someone needed to witness. I want to do the same thing." "You're 17, Daniel said gently. "You don't have to take on that burden yet." "I'm 17 and fluent in 9 languages because you taught me that language is about connection and responsibility," Emma countered. "I'm 17 and I've watched you and Grandpa prove that invisible people can change the world. I'm not too young to start doing the same thing." Daniel reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Your mother and I used to talk about who you'd become. She had all these dreams, that you'd be brave, that you'd fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, that you'd use whatever gifts you had to make the world better. You're becoming everything she hoped for." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I wish she could see it." "I think she does," Daniel said softly. "I think she and Grandpa are both watching, and they're so proud they can barely stand it." They sat together in comfortable silence, this father and daughter who'd survived injustice and emerged stronger, who'd turned their family's hardest experiences into a legacy of advocacy and change. A year later, Daniel stood in the same federal courthouse where he'd been exonerated, but this time he was there as a guest. The courthouse was dedicating a new program, judicial training on recognizing class and credential bias, built on the model Judge Hammond had pioneered. The program would be required for all federal judges, with regular refreshers and accountability measures. During the dedication ceremony, Hammond spoke about his own failures and growth. 3.5 years ago, I nearly destroyed an innocent man's life because I couldn't see past my own assumptions. I assumed that expertise required credentials, that someone from a working-class background couldn't possibly possess exceptional abilities, that my judgment was infallible. I was wrong on every count. This program exists to make sure other judges learn from my mistakes without having to commit them first. After the ceremony, Daniel was surrounded by people wanting to talk, judges who'd attended the Chicago conference, prosecutors who'd worked similar cases, advocates who'd used his story to push for policy changes. But the person he most wanted to see was waiting at the back of the room. Agent Martinez approached with a man Daniel didn't recognize, mid-40s, wearing a suit, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Daniel," Martinez said, "this is Michael Thornberry. He owns the estate your father maintained for all those years." Daniel shook the man's hand, uncertain where this was going. Mr. Cross, Thornberry said, I need to apologize to you and to honor your father's memory. I inherited the Thornberry estate from my uncle 15 years ago. I knew he rented it to diplomatic families, but I didn't ask questions about who those families were or what they were doing. When Operation Invisible Eye happened, when I learned my property had been used for trafficking, I was horrified. But I was also a coward. I sold the estate and pretended it had nothing to do with me. He paused, clearly struggling with emotion. Your father worked for my family for over 2 decades. He was in our home, keeping it running, and we never really saw him. We certainly never knew what he was documenting, how he was using his position to gather evidence. When I learned the full story, when I read his journals for the trial, I realized that Joseph Cross showed more courage cleaning my house than I've shown in my entire privileged life. Thornberry pulled out an envelope and handed it to Daniel. This is a donation to the Joseph Cross Fellowship in the amount of $5 million. It won't undo what happened on my property, but it will help create opportunities for people like your father, people who society overlooks, but who possess extraordinary integrity and ability. I hope you'll accept it. Daniel opened the envelope, saw the bank draft, and felt his breath catch. $5 million. Enough to expand the fellowship dramatically, to create endowed positions, to build something permanent. Mr. Thornberry, this is overdue, Thornberry interrupted. Your father earned far more than we ever paid him, not in salary, but in recognition, in respect, in acknowledgement of his value as a human being. I can't give him that now, but I can make sure his legacy helps others. Please, let me do this one right thing. Daniel accepted the donation, and later that evening, he and Emma and Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb sat in a restaurant celebrating what this would mean for the fellowship. They could help hundreds of people now, maybe thousands over time. They could create research positions, fund community programs, build partnerships with institutions around the world. Your father changed everything, Webb said, raising his glass. He proved that witness matters, that invisible people see what the powerful miss, that documentation and patience and moral clarity can overcome even the most entrenched injustice. Here's to Joseph Cross, and to everyone carrying forward his work. They toasted, and Daniel felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since before his father's death. The work wasn't finished. It would never truly be finished, because injustice was ongoing and always required opposition. But the foundation was solid now. The systems were changing. The invisible people were being seen. 5 years after his exoneration, Daniel received word that Judge Hammond had passed away. Heart attack, sudden and quick. The news hit harder than he'd expected. Hammond had become something like a mentor in the years since the trial, someone who demonstrated that growth was possible even when failure was public and painful. Daniel attended the funeral, sitting in the back of the church, listening to Hammond's colleagues talk about his dedication to reforming judicial practices, his humility in confronting his own biases, his determination to be better. After the service, Hammond's daughter approached Daniel. She was in her 30s, a public defender in Philadelphia, and her eyes were red from crying. Mr. Cross, my father spoke about you often. He said you gave him the gift of accountability, the chance to be better. I wanted to thank you for that. She handed him a letter. He wrote this before he died. He wanted you to have it. Daniel opened the letter that evening, sitting in his apartment with Emma reading beside him on the couch. Hammond's handwriting was precise and clear. Dear Daniel, I'm writing this because I've been diagnosed with a heart condition that makes my remaining time uncertain. I wanted to make sure you knew something before I run out of opportunities to tell you. You saved my career. More importantly, you saved my soul. For 19 years, I sat in judgment of others, believing my credentials and experience made me qualified to determine truth. I was so certain, so confident in my ability to spot deception. And then you stood in my courtroom, handcuffed and honest, and I laughed at you. I dismissed you. I nearly destroyed you. That moment, when Dr. Chen demonstrated your abilities, when I realized how profoundly wrong I'd been, that changed everything for me. I could have doubled down, protected my ego, blamed others. Instead, you and Dr. Chen gave me the space to acknowledge failure and grow from it. The past 3 years have been the most meaningful of my career. I've worked with hundreds of judges, helping them recognize biases they didn't know they held, I've watched policies change, seen defendants get fair hearings, witnessed small shifts in a massive system. None of that would have happened without you. But more than professional impact, you reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. Not to wield power, but to seek truth. Not to validate my assumptions, but to challenge them. Not to judge from certainty, but to decide with humility. Your father's journals sit on my shelf. I've read them multiple times, studying how Joseph Cross witnessed with such clarity and patience. He taught you to see. You taught me to see better. That's a gift I can never repay. Thank you for being extraordinary. Thank you for refusing to let the system's blindness diminish your truth. And thank you for believing that even someone who wronged you could learn to do better. With profound respect and gratitude, Richard Hammond. Daniel read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Emma moved closer, reading over his shoulder, her own eyes wet. He really did change, she said softly. Yeah, Daniel agreed. He did. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside one of his father's journals. The first one. The one where Joseph had written about taking Daniel to work, about teaching him to witness, about believing that invisible people could matter. 10 years after his exoneration, Daniel stood at a podium in the United Nations building in Geneva, Switzerland. He'd been invited to speak at an international conference on human trafficking to share his father's story and the lessons learned from Operation Invisible Eye and the subsequent trial. The room was filled with delegates from 80 countries, all of them engaged in the fight against trafficking and exploitation. Emma sat in the front row, now 25, a human rights lawyer working for the International Justice Mission, fluent in 12 languages and using every one of them to fight for victims. My father was a janitor, Daniel began. He cleaned houses for people who never learned his name. He was invisible by design, by class structure, by the fundamental inequity that makes some people matter and others merely exist in service to them. But invisibility gave him access. It let him witness crimes that powerful people committed in plain sight, believing that someone like him couldn't understand or wouldn't care. He walked the delegates through Joseph's documentation, through the 26 years of careful record-keeping, through the languages Daniel had learned specifically to translate those records. He explained how a trafficking network had operated for decades because the people who could have stopped it never thought to listen to someone cleaning their floors. The lesson isn't just about my father, Daniel said. It's about every person working in margins and shadows, every housekeeper and driver and security guard who sees what the powerful miss. They are the witnesses we ignore, the sources we dismiss, the expertise we refuse to validate, and in dismissing them, we allow injustice to flourish. He shared data from the Joseph Cross Fellowship. How many fellows had gone on to careers in advocacy, law, academia, translation? How many had used their abilities to help trafficking survivors, to translate testimony, to bridge linguistic and cultural gaps in legal proceedings? How invisible people, once given opportunities, had changed systems from within. We've trained over 200 fellows in the past decade, Daniel said. Every one of them was rejected by traditional academic institutions before finding us. Every one of them possessed abilities that credentialing systems couldn't recognize. And every one of them is now contributing to fights against injustice in ways their rejectors said was impossible. That's not just vindication, that's transformation. The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, delegates from dozens of countries approached Daniel, wanting to create similar programs in their own nations, to build networks that valued ability over credentials, to make sure their own invisible people were finally seen. Emma found him during a break, her eyes shining with pride. Dad, there's someone who wants to meet you. She's been waiting. She led him to a quiet corner where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, her face lined with age but her eyes bright and alert. Emma made the introduction in Russian. This is Ekaterina Volkov. She says she knew you when you were children. Daniel's heart stopped. Katya. The little girl who taught him Russian while homesick for Moscow, who'd shared her language like a gift, who disappeared when her family rotated back to Russia when Daniel was 10. He knelt beside her wheelchair and switched to Russian. Katya? Is it really you? Daniel Cross, she said, her Russian tinged with the passage of decades, but still fundamentally the same voice he remembered. The boy who learned faster than I could teach. I've been following your story. When I saw you were speaking here, I had to come. How did you? I've been a translator for the UN for 40 years, Katya said, smiling. Human Rights Division. I've spent my career using the languages I grew up with to help people who couldn't speak for themselves. When I heard about your father's work, about how you learned languages to translate his documentation, I understood. We learned the same lesson, you and I. That language is power when used for witness. They talked for an hour, catching up on decades, comparing notes on how languages had shaped their lives. Katya had heard about the fellowship, had watched from afar as Daniel transformed personal trauma into institutional change. Your father would be so proud, she said finally. The boy I taught Russian to, you became exactly what the world needed. Someone who refuses to let invisible people stay invisible. Emma stood nearby, documenting the conversation on her phone, tears streaming down her face as she watched her father reconnect with one of the people who'd made him who he was. That evening, Daniel, Emma, and Katya had dinner together at a small restaurant near the UN building. They switched between languages naturally, Russian, English, French, the way multilingual people do when they're comfortable with each other. Katya shared stories about her decades at the UN, the cases she'd worked on, the lives she'd touched through translation. The invisible people are the ones who change everything, Katya said. The translators who make communication possible. The janitors who witness what others miss. The housekeepers who understand 6 languages because they need to survive in spaces where they're not supposed to matter. We're the infrastructure that holds up the visible world. Your father understood that. You've made sure others understand it too. 2 years later, the book was published. Invisible Witness: How a Janitor's Journals Changed Everything became an immediate bestseller, combining Joseph Cross's original documentation with interviews from trafficking survivors, legal analysis of the cases, and reflections on how invisible people's witness transformed justice. Daniel did a book tour with Elena and several other survivors, using every event not just to promote the book, but to raise awareness about ongoing trafficking, about the importance of believing victims, about the value of witness from people society overlooks. At an event in Millbrook, Daniel's first time back to his hometown for a major public appearance, the local library was packed beyond capacity. People who'd known Joseph Cross, who'd dismissed him as just a janitor, who'd never imagined his work mattered beyond clean floors and functioning plumbing, came to understand what he'd actually accomplished. Mrs. Palmer, the neighbor who'd watched Emma during Daniel's incarceration, stood during the Q&A portion. I knew your father for 20 years, Daniel. I thought I knew what his life was about. I was wrong. We all were. Thank you for making sure we finally see him. The mayor of Millbrook announced that the public library would be renamed the Joseph Cross Memorial Library, dedicated to resources about human trafficking, immigrant rights, and programs for overlooked populations. Daniel stood at the dedication ceremony, Emma beside him, and felt the full circle completion of something his father had started without ever imagining where it would lead. 15 years after his exoneration, Daniel received an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University. He stood on the same stage where he'd watched Joseph Cross Fellows graduate, wearing academic regalia for the first time in his life, listening to Dr. Chen describe his contributions to linguistics, social justice, and institutional reform. Dr. Daniel Cross, she said, emphasizing the title that made him a legitimate member of the academic community that had once dismissed him, has spent 15 years proving that ability transcends credentials, that learning happens in margins as legitimately as in classrooms, and that invisible people possess expertise we desperately need. He's transformed how we think about language acquisition, how we evaluate competence, and how we create opportunities for extraordinary people who don't fit traditional molds. When they placed the hood over his shoulders, when they handed him the diploma that certified what he'd always known he could do, Daniel thought about his father watching from wherever the dead watch from. About his mother, whose languages he still carried. About Sarah, who'd believed in him before anyone else did. About every person who'd taught him languages as an act of friendship, never imagining they were giving him tools that would change lives. Emma, now a respected human rights lawyer with a resume that included work in 14 countries and testimony before international tribunals, stood with the other faculty members, wiping tears from her eyes. After the ceremony, surrounded by fellows and faculty and advocates and survivors, Daniel felt something he'd spent most of his life chasing: belonging. Not because he'd finally gotten the right credentials, but because he'd built a community that valued truth over paperwork, ability over pedigree, substance over form. That night, alone in his apartment, the same small space he'd lived in for 20 years, though he could have afforded larger, Daniel sat with his father's journals spread across the table. He'd read them hundreds of times, but tonight he read with new understanding. Not as a son seeking to understand his father, but as a man who'd finished the work his father started. The final entry in this final journal, written 2 weeks before Joseph's death, read simply, "Daniel is building something legitimate. Translation business growing. Emma is thriving. I think I can rest now, knowing the witness continues." But Joseph hadn't rested. The witness had continued through trials and fellowships and policy changes and institutional transformations. Through 500 judges learning to check their biases. Through 200 fellows finding opportunities that had been closed to them. Through survivors of trafficking seeing their abusers convicted and their stories validated. The witness continued through Emma, who'd inherited the family calling and transformed it into international advocacy. Through Katya, who'd spent 40 years at the UN translating for the voiceless. Through every person who'd learned that invisible people see everything, and that seeing, really seeing, is the first step toward justice. Daniel pulled out his phone and recorded a video, something he'd been planning for months but hadn't found the right moment for. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Daniel Cross. My father was Joseph Cross, a janitor who documented crimes for 26 years because he believed invisible people had a responsibility to witness. I learned 11 languages because I followed my father to work and paid attention to people who thought I didn't matter. I was prosecuted for fraud because the system couldn't believe someone like me could possess expertise without credentials. And I was vindicated because a few people were brave enough to question their assumptions and value truth over pedigree." He paused, gathering his thoughts. If you're watching this and you're someone society overlooks, if you clean houses or drive cabs or work night shifts, if you've taught yourself skills the system won't recognize, if you possess abilities no one believes in, I want you to know something. You matter. Your witness matters. Your expertise matters. And there are people fighting to create spaces where you can prove what you've always known about yourself. He uploaded the video to the Joseph Cross Fellowship website. By morning, it had been viewed 10,000 times. By the end of the week, 1 million. Comments poured in from housekeepers who'd taught themselves accounting, from security guards who'd learned programming, from immigrants who spoke 6 languages but couldn't get jobs because they lacked credentials. Invisible people, seeing themselves in Daniel's story, finding courage to step forward. 20 years after his exoneration, Daniel Cross, now 57, with gray in his hair and permanent smile lines around his eyes, stood in his apartment looking at photographs covering his walls. His father and mother on their wedding day. Emma graduating from law school. The first cohort of Joseph Cross Fellows, survivors from the trafficking case. Judge Hammond receiving an award for judicial reform 6 months before his death. Katya at the UN, translating testimony that would free dozens of victims. His phone rang. Emma, calling from Nairobi where she was working on a major trafficking case. "Dad, we got the conviction. All 5 defendants, life sentences. The testimony from survivors was incredible, and the translated documents were key to proving conspiracy. None of this would have happened without the protocols you and Grandpa helped establish." Daniel felt his eyes burn with familiar tears. "Your grandfather would be so proud, sweetheart." "He'd be proud of both of us," Emma said. "We finished his work. We made sure invisible people were seen." After they hung up, Daniel walked to his window and looked out at Millbrook. The same town, transformed by time and understanding. The Joseph Cross Memorial Library stood where children now learned that janitors could be heroes, that witness could change systems, that invisible people see everything. He thought about his father, 26 years of careful documentation, about languages learned in living rooms and kitchens, taught by children who became lifelong friends, about Sarah, who'd believed in him when belief felt impossible, about Judge Hammond, who'd learned to question certainty, about Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb, who'd fought for truth when fighting seemed futile. And he thought about all the invisible people still out there, still witnessing, still hoping someone would finally see them. The work continued. The witness continued. The harvest from seeds planted in darkness continued to grow toward light. Daniel Cross, son of a janitor, speaker of 11 languages, survivor of injustice, builder of systems that valued truth over credentials, stood at his window and felt his father's presence like a blessing. "We did it, Dad," he whispered. "We made sure they couldn't stay invisible anymore." And somewhere, in whatever space exists between justice and hope, Joseph Cross smiled and rested, knowing his son had carried the witness forward, knowing that invisible people would never be unseen again, knowing that the work he'd started in shadows had finally permanently transformed into light.